Welcome to Just Conversations, where we have conversations just like this. Chapter 14, The Grand Miracle. A light that shone from behind the sun. The sun was not so fierce as to pierce where that light could. Charles Williams. The central miracle asserted by Christians is the Incarnation. They say that God became man. Every other miracle prepares for this, or exhibits this, or results from this. Just as every natural event is the manifestation at a particular place and moment of nature's total character, so every particular Christian miracle manifests at a particular place and moment the character and significance of the Incarnation. There is no question in Christianity of arbitrary interferences just scattered about. It relates not a series of disconnected raids on nature, but the various steps of a strategically coherent invasion, an invasion which intends complete conquest and occupation. You remember we talked about this earlier, about how Lewis talked about what a miracle is, how when it's coming into nature, it's coming in as an invasion. In this situation, he's talking about miracles as an invasion. He's talking about how they, but they're not like raids by some marauding party of warriors that's hitting things sporadically and stealing from towns where it can and hitting targets of opportunity. Right? It's part of a coherent and consistent strategy.
You're saying that the miracles aren't breaking the rules?
No, I'm not saying they're not breaking the rules. Lewis did say that they don't break the rules earlier. What I'm saying is that Lewis is saying that that miracle, no instance of a miracle in the Christian compendium of miracles, no instance of miracle could be something tacked on, nothing sporadic, nothing haphazard. In order for it to fit into the Christian body of work, into the Christian compendium, it has to exhibit the character of that Christianity has been exhibiting from the very beginning, right? This is because what Lewis is really doing here in this chapter is establishing a standard by which to judge miracles. Which ones are true and which ones are false? Because there's a bunch of stories about miracles, and most of them are probably false.
You're saying even the ones that are in the Bible?
No, I'm saying
you're saying everyday.
I'm saying miracles that you hear about on, like you said, in an everyday situation. People will attribute something to a miracle. They will think that a miracle happened, but most of those miracles that people are calling miracles are probably not miracles. In fact, as he said earlier in the book, it's not just that most miracles are probably false, or most accounts of miracles are probably false, but most accounts of probably everything are almost always false. It's not just miracles that get judged by this standard, but any event, any story that someone tells, any interaction that someone relates to you, it's either covered up by someone's biases, or details are forgotten, or there's just an outright lie involved. So a lot of things that are passed around, whether they're miracles or not, a lot of stories that are passed around, whether they're about miracles or not, are probably false. We need a standard then by which to judge miracles. How do you know which miracle? How do you know whether a story about a miracle is true, and how do you know if it's false? Lewis is providing us with a roadmap to make that decision. He says to begin this chapter that that every miracle in the Bible, every miracle that's a part of the Christian corpus, needs to be judged by the standard of how it exhibits the character of the Incarnation. The Incarnation is the central miracle of Christianity. God became man. This is the Incarnation. Christ was incarnated as man, fully man and fully God in the Incarnation. This is the central miracle. This is why this chapter is called The Grand Miracle. So another thread or assertion of Christianity is that from the very beginning, this was the intention of God, to display this miracle, to make this miracle, to to bring this miracle about, and to bring this miracle about as a way of reconciling, as the way of reconciling man to God. This is the central idea of Christianity. And it's evidenced in the Incarnation itself. Now, if you look at what Lewis is going to do in this chapter, in the next couple of chapters, is show how the Incarnation and all miracles that he categorizes later are exhibiting the character of the Incarnation itself. They're either preparing for the Incarnation, they are a part of the Incarnation, or they are a result of the Incarnation. Right. So this is the standard he's trying to establish by which we can judge whether a miracle is true. He says the fitness and therefore credibility of the particular miracles depends on their relation to the grand miracle. All discussion of them in isolation from it is futile. The fitness or credibility of the grand miracle itself cannot obviously be judged by the same standard, and let us admit at once that it is very difficult to find a standard by which it can be judged. If the thing happened, the Incarnation he means, it was the central event in the history of the earth, the very thing that the whole story has been about. Since it happened only once, and it is by Hume's standards, since it happened only once, it is by Hume's standards infinitely improbable. Remember, we talked about David Hume's standard for why miracles couldn't occur, or I shouldn't say a standard, but his definition or his reasoning for why miracles couldn't occur, why they're nonsense, because of their improbability, right? So by his standard, obviously this one event, which has only happened once, it's never happened before, it'll never happen again, it is infinitely improbable by Hume's standards. He goes on to say, but then the whole history of the earth has also happened only once. Is it therefore incredible? Just like you, only one person like you has ever existed. By Hume's standards, your existence is infinitely improbable also. In fact, almost any event is, statistically, an event like someone's birth, or you getting a certain job, or you marrying a certain person. All of these events, statistically, it depends on how you categorize them, have happened millions of times. But this person in this situation with these characteristics has never happened before. So in that sense, by Hume's standard, all events are infinitely improbable. And as Lewis points out, the history of the earth, if we looked at it in total, has happened only once. The whole history of the earth, all of it, from start to finish, whatever the finish will be, all of it has happened only once, and therefore is infinitely improbable by Hume's standards. So we're kind of casting doubt on that standard by saying, well, by that standard, almost everything is infinitely improbable. And if that's the case, then really we need to cast about for a different standard, because obviously Hume's can't measure up to what we need, not just for miracles or Christianity or the Incarnation itself, but period. It's not a statistical measure that we can use to shed any light on anything. Hence the difficulty, Lewis goes on, which weighs upon Christian and atheist alike, of estimating the probability of the Incarnation. It is like asking whether the existence of nature herself is intrinsically probable. That is why it is easier to argue, on historical grounds, that the Incarnation actually occurred than to show, on philosophical grounds, the probability of its occurrence. The historical difficulty of giving for the life, sayings, and influence of Jesus any explanation that is not harder than the Christian explanation is very great. The discrepancy between the depth and sanity, and let me add, shrewdness of his moral teaching, and the rampant megalomania which must lie behind his theological teaching unless he is indeed God, has never been satisfactorily got over. So we've got on one hand Christ saying spectacular things that even non-religious or even atheistic people will acknowledge are the Jefferson did this, for example. He was an agnostic, and he acknowledges that this is the highest moral system he's encountered, the morals of Jesus, that is. And on the other hand, if this person is not God, and this is one of Lewis's more famous lines of thinking, if this person is not God, if Christ is not God, is this person not really just a megalomaniac?
Megalomaniac.
Someone with a spectacularly large ego. I mean, think about the claims that Christ is making. He's speaking about what is moral and what isn't from the position of the self-proclaimed position of the Son of God. Now, that's not a person we can take seriously. If the first claim, I'm the Son of God, isn't true, we can't really take serious the second claim, whatever, or the consequent claims. Here are some morals you should abide by. He kind of cuts the ground out from underneath himself when he's making a claim about God, if in fact he isn't God, and then goes on to make subsequent moral claims about moral claims that should, or morals that should have some claim on our conscience and on our behavior.
Could you simplify that a little more, please?
Sure. If a person who is homeless walks up to you as you're walking down the street and they're naked, or their clothes are all torn up and their hair is matted and they smell terrible and they're ranting financial advice to you, this person really doesn't have credibility, right? You're not going to take this person's financial advice and make stock purchases, right? You're not going to refinance your home based on what this person is saying. Now, the advice they're giving you may be bad, it may be good, but their credibility is kind of lost by the presentation, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're aside from being homeless, they're also not very well put together, and they look and sound insane. Lewis is saying if Christ isn't God, as he claims to be, where does his moral framework get its grounding? Where's the credibility for these sayings going to come from, right? This is coming from a spectacularly large ego, if in fact he is not who he says he is. He says, and this problem has not really ever been got over by anybody who tried to claim that Christ was just a wise man or just some sort of philosopher. This is a difficult conundrum, to reconcile. And this is one of Lewis is kind of famous for this being one of his lines of reasoning, that either Christ is who he says he is, or he's insane. And there's really no middle ground, right? He's a nut, or he is who he says he is. And we really can't have it both ways. And there's a reason why most people have tried to criticize Lewis about this. I think he would say the reason is because they want to keep the morals, because they like them. After all, they're sublime. And the morals are sublime. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The meek shall inherit the earth. I mean, these are beautiful sayings that really resonate with us, especially having been raised in the culture we've been raised in, and it having been so successful based on those morals. People want to keep them. They want to hang on to them, and they want to sort of rescue Jesus from the insane asylum that we must throw him into, historically speaking, if he's not God. Clear now?
Yes.
Okay. Lewis goes on to say, hence the non-Christian hypotheses succeed one another with the restless fertility of bewilderment. So they keep trying to come up with new ways to explain this without success. Today we are asked to regard all the theological elements as later accretions to the story of a historical and merely human Jesus. Yesterday, we were asked to believe that the whole thing began with vegetation myths and mystery religions, and that the pseudo-historical man was only fadged up at a later date. But this historical inquiry is outside the scope of my book. So he says, at one point in history, we were, especially modern history, we were asked to believe that the theological elements of Jesus' story, for instance, the claim to being the Son of God, even the miracles themselves that Jesus does in the gospel were later accretions. They were add-ons to the story by later editors of the story. That they weren't there as part of the original story. That they weren't there as part of the original event. He says there, and that's sort of fashionable. He's writing. I believe he's writing this book in the 50s or 60s. That was sort of fashionable at that time to think that. But in an age just previous to that, attacks on the gospel were leveled in a different way. They would say that the entire gospel myth, as it was called by people who were critiquing it, was a result of vegetation myths. We know some of these, right? We know Ceres, the Greek god of of uh, of vegetation, essentially, where we get our name cereal, was worshipped along the same. There were many gods that were worshipped this way. That they were worshipped. They were sort of their death was celebrated in the fall when the crops were harvested, and their rebirth was celebrated in the spring when the crops began to grow. These vegetation myths, these corn kings, they're often called. Christ was said to be one of them. Just this story was another version of the vegetation myth, and the whole thing, the whole character of Christ was, as Lewis put, fadged up or pulled out of nothing, and later sort of became a person that never really existed. Right? The myth became a person, and the person never really existed. These are he's listing these as examples of people trying to get over the fact that Christ, if he's not God, is a lunatic. He goes on, since the incarnation, if it is a fact, holds this central position, and since we are assuming that we do not yet know it to have happened on historical grounds, we are in a position which may be illustrated by the following analogy. Let us suppose we possess parts of a novel or a symphony. Someone now brings us a newly discovered piece of manuscript and says, this is the missing part of the work. This is the chapter on which the whole plot of the novel really turned. This is the main theme of the symphony. Our business would be to see whether the new passage, if admitted to the central place which the discoverer claimed for it, did actually illuminate all the parts we had already seen and pull them together. Nor should we be likely to go very far wrong. The new passage, if spurious, however attractive it looked at the first glance, would become harder and harder to reconcile with the rest of the work the longer we considered the matter. But if it were genuine, then at every fresh hearing of the music, or every fresh reading of the book, we should find it settling down, making itself more at home, and eliciting significance from all sorts of details in the whole work which we had hitherto neglected. Even though the new central chapter, or main theme, contained great difficulties in itself, we should still think it genuine, provided that it continually removed difficulties elsewhere. Something like this we must do with the doctrine of the Incarnation. Here, instead of a symphony or a novel, we have the whole mass of our knowledge. The credibility will depend on the extent to which the doctrine, if accepted, can illuminate and integrate that whole mass. It is much less important that the doctrine itself should be fully comprehensible. We believe that the sun is in the sky at midday in summer, not because we can clearly see the sun, in fact we cannot, but because we can see everything else. Right, so you've got this analogy where, let's say we had this novel, maybe it was a famous novel, or this piece of music, this symphony, and maybe it was a famous symphony, and it had been around for a long time. And someone claimed that they found a missing piece to the symphony, or a missing chapter to the novel. If we took this chapter and integrated it into the novel, gave it the place that the person who found it was claiming for it, this central place, would it fit? Could you read the novel and find the new details of the new chapter settling into the theme of the novel? Did it remove difficulties that were there in the story before? Did it settle themes that were there? Did it resolve plot lines? Did it fit with the rest of the story? Same with the symphony. If a new piece is added to the symphony, did it harmonize with the rest of the symphony? Was it sonorous with the rest of the symphony, right? And the more we heard the symphony with this new piece added, and the more we read the novel with this new chapter added, we should feel that more and more. It should settle down with the novel or the symphony, or in this case, the Incarnation, more and more. We should feel it at home with the Incarnation more and more. He says something like this we must do with the Incarnation. The first difficulty that occurs to any critic of the doctrine lies in the very center of it. What can be meant by God became man? In what sense is it conceivable that eternal self-existent spirit basic facthood, should be so combined with a natural human organism as to make one person? And this would be a fatal stumbling block if we had not already discovered that in every human being a more than natural activity, the act of reasoning, and therefore presumably a more than natural agent, is thus united with a part of nature, so united that the composite creature calls itself I and me. I am not, of course, suggesting that what happened when God became man was simply another instance of this process, the process by which we receive our reasoning, right? Birth, in other words. In other men, a supernatural creature thus becomes, in union with a natural creature, one human being. In Jesus, it is held, the supernatural creator himself did so. I do not think anything we do will enable us to imagine the mode of consciousness of the incarnate God. That is where the doctrine is not fully comprehensible. But the difficulty which we felt in the mere idea of the supernatural descending into the natural is apparently non-existent, or is at least overcome in the person of every man. If we did not know by experience what it feels like to be a rational animal, how all these natural facts, all this biochemistry and instinctive affection or repulsion and sensuous perception can become the medium of rational thought and moral, can become the medium of rational thought and moral will, and moral will, dang it, let me start this sentence over again. If we did not know by experience what it feels like to be a rational animal, how all these natural facts, all this biochemistry and instinctive affection or repulsion and sensuous perception can become the medium of rational thought and moral will, which understand necessary relations and acknowledge modes of behavior as universally binding, we could not conceive, much less imagine, the thing happening. In other words, if we didn't have our experience of all of these things, of biochemistry, of sensuous experience, of reasoning, we couldn't imagine God becoming man. We'd have no medium by which to do so. We'd have no way to relate to that event. But we experience a degree of that in ourselves. This is what Lewis is saying. We experience a degree of that because all of this complexity that is our experience is a type of prefigurement, or maybe not prefigurement, but an example, a preparation for understanding God becoming man. That process itself. Here, God, the ultimate facthood, becomes man, enters into some sort of natural relation with the world. We do this, right? In a way, because we are part of the world. There's no doubt about that. We're part of the material aspect of the universe. We're flesh. We live, we die, we rot. This is apparent to everyone. But there's also a part of our experience that tells us something more is going on than just that, right? We can call ourselves animals and beasts, but we know there's something a little bit more to us than that. At least we treat each other that way. We treat each other like there's something more to ourselves than just that. So that sense that we have, that perception that we have of something more, is maybe a toehold on our ability to understand how God could become man. Lewis says we're not going to fully understand this because it would be impossible. It's not hard to imagine that it's going to be impossible to understand the reasoning or the mind of the incarnate God.
Mm.
He says this is the part of the doctrine that's incomprehensible. But we have a little bit of experience with it. We have a toehold on it because of our own experience with consciousness, with reasoning, with our combination of the physical and the physical material with the conscious spiritual. Right? We have this own experience that we can compare that to. The discrepancy between a movement of atoms in an astronomer's cortex and his understanding that there must be a still unobserved planet beyond Uranus is already so immense that the incarnation of God himself is, in one sense, scarcely more startling. So that's something we kind of take for granted, the idea that someone can see some small thing that is millions of miles away, hundreds of millions of miles away even, and from that infer that there must be something there. That, aided by calculations, a very small observation from tens of millions of miles away can lead an astronomer to infer some really invaluable piece of knowledge, right? That he can come to some invaluable conclusion. It's a pretty remarkable thing when you think about it. We're We're probably inured to this by the fact that we do it all the time. Maybe not at the level that the astronomer is doing it, but we do this all the time. We infer, we we use a chain of reasoning to come to a conclusion. And this is actually a pretty remarkable feat that we accomplish. This feat, Lewis says, is kind of a clue to us, a key to us that the incarnation is not as startling as we might have thought it to be when we frame it in that context. He says we cannot conceive how the divine spirit dwelled within the created and human spirit of Jesus, but neither can we conceive how his human spirit, or that of any man, dwells within his natural organism. So we really don't have an explanation for our own consciousness, our own reasoning, our own ability to transcend the material world and look at things from a macro perspective. We really don't have an explanation for that either. So the idea that God could do this, the inexplicability of how God could do this, is not really all that hard to swallow, given that here we are too, unable to explain our own dwelling in this body, our own spirit indwelled state in this body. Not really able to explain that either. What we can understand, if the Christian doctrine is true, is that our own composite existence is not the sheer anomaly it might seem to be, but a faint image of the divine incarnation itself, the same theme in a very minor key. We can understand that if God so descends into a human spirit, and human spirit so descends into nature, and our thoughts into our senses and passions, and if adult minds, but only the best of them, can descend into sympathy with children, and men into sympathy with beasts, then everything hangs together, and the total reality, both natural and supernatural, in which we are living is more multifariously and subtly harmonious than we had suspected. So there's a pattern here, right? There's a pattern of the higher descending into the lower. God descending into a fleshly state. Us descending into, as he says here, um, um, and our thoughts into our senses and passions. Our thoughts descend into our senses and our passions. Some of us, the very best of us, descend into sympathy with children, the higher into the lower. Men descend into sympathy with beasts, a dog, a cat, other animals. In fact, we look at people who can't do that, who can't enjoy a dog or enjoy children and sympathize and come to an understanding with children to get down to their level. We look at them as unfortunate creatures, right? We look at them as almost like there's something wrong with them. This ability to descend from the higher into the lower is almost a mark of maturity. It's almost a mark of refinement. We do this with animals too. Like nobody walks up to an animal and says, "Good day, sir." Right? That's not how we talk to them. We talk to a dog as though we're going to play with it. We talk to a cat with almost like a baby voice. And whether that's the way that animals can understand us or not, it's a mark of refinement and maturity that a person is able to do that. We catch sight of a new key principle: the power of the higher, just in so far as it is truly higher, to come down; the power of the greater, to include the less. Thus solid bodies exemplify many truths of plane geometry, but plane figures no truths of solid geometry. Many inorganic propositions are true of organisms, but no organic propositions are true of minerals. Montaigne became kittenish with his kitten, but she never talked philosophy to him. Everywhere the great enters the little, its power to do so is almost the test of its greatness. In the Christian story, God descends to reascend. He comes down from the heights of absolute being into time and space, down into humanity, down further still, if embryologists are right, to recapitulate in the womb ancient and pre-human phases of life, down to the very roots and seabed of the nature he has created. But he goes down to come up again, and bring the whole ruined world up with him. One has the picture of a strong man stooping lower and lower to get himself underneath some great complicated burden. He must stoop in order to lift. He must also disappear under the load before he incredibly straightens his back and marches off with the whole mass swaying on his shoulders. Or one may think of a diver, first reducing himself to nakedness, then glancing in midair then gone with a splash, vanished, rushing down through green and warm water into black and cold water, down through increasing pressure into the death-like region of ooze and slime and old decay, then up again, back to color and light, his lungs almost bursting, till suddenly he breaks surface again, holding in his hand the dripping, precious thing that he went down to recover. He and it are both colored now that they have come up into the light. Down below, where it lay colorless in the dark, he lost his color too. So this is Christ, right? This is Christ descending from the higher down into the lower, as Lewis says, down to this, down to even to being an embryo, and in the womb, we're told by embryologists that man recapitulates all the former versions of himself. The trail of evolutionary history is almost relived by every human embryo in the womb. We exhibit the characteristics of fish, of birds. At one point, I'm told, I don't really understand this, but at one point in the gestation process, humans even have feathers for just a little while. We exhibit all of these characteristics of our former versions. So Christ went through this too. God stoops to the very lowest the very lowest level of his creation in the incarnation. Lewis says this is a pattern that just keeps showing up, and so it's telling us something with this pattern. We're hearing something here. He goes on, in this descent and reascent, everyone will recognize a familiar pattern, a thing written all over the world. It is the pattern of all vegetable life. It must belittle itself into something hard, small, and death-like. It must fall into the ground. Thence the new life reascends. It is the pattern of all animal generation, too. There is descent from the full and perfect organisms into the spermatozoon and ovum, and into the dark womb, a life, at first inferior in kind to that of the species which is being reproduced, then the slow ascent to the perfect embryo, to the living, conscious baby, and finally to the adult. So it is also in our moral and emotional life. The first innocent and spontaneous desires have to submit to the death-like process of control or total denial. But from that, there is a reascent to fully formed character in which the strength of the original material all operates, but in a new way. Death and rebirth, go down to go up. It is a key principle. Through this bottleneck, this belittlement, the high road nearly always lies. So we have to go through this we have to go through this pattern to come to the high road, as he says here, this pattern of of descent in order to reascend. We do this in our biological capacity as first an embryo and then a fully formed human, but we also do this in our moral life as simpletons at first. The doctrine of the Incarnation, he says, if accepted, puts this principle even more emphatically at the center. The pattern is there in nature because it was first there in God. All the instances of it, which I have mentioned, turn out to be but transpositions of the divine theme into a minor key. I am not now referring simply to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. The total pattern, of which they are only the turning point, is the real death and rebirth. For certainly no seed ever fell from so fair a tree into so dark and cold a soil as would furnish more than a faint analogy to this huge descent and reascension in which God degraded the salt and oozy bottom of creation, dredged the salt and oozy bottom of creation. So even though we don't have a perfect analogy of that, with, say, a seed falling into the ground and growing up into a plant, it has to fall into the ground as something death-like before it can, because that's what a seed is. A seed is dead until it's in the ground. It's nourished by soil or water, and eventually sunlight, and then it's able to become its higher self, the higher version of itself, able to grow into something else, into something fruitful again. And he says we don't have a perfect analogy of this because no seed ever fell from so fair a height as Christ coming down to be incarnated as flesh. But we're given pictures of this. We're given images of this in the world around us.
Mm.
From this point of view, the Christian doctrine makes itself so quickly at home amid the deepest apprehensions of reality which we have from other sources that doubt may spring up in a new direction. Is it not fitting in too well? And this is a reference that Lewis made earlier to the fact that many people attributed the Christian message to an earlier version of divine stories called vegetation myths, and we talked about these just a moment ago.
Yeah.
The
dying of the crops and then the resurrection or new crop
in spring.
in spring. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that pattern. There's lots of vegetation myths, and they're all over the world. There's many examples of them. So he says, is this fitting in a little too well? In other words, haven't we seen this pattern before? And couldn't we attribute the existence of the Christian story to a myth? He says so well, it's fitting in so well, he means so well that it must have come into men's minds from seeing this pattern elsewhere, particularly in the annual death and resurrection of the corn. For there have, of course, been many religions in which that annual drama, so important for the life of the tribe, was almost admittedly the central theme. And the deity, Adonis, Osiris, or another, almost undisguisedly a personification of the corn, a corn king who died and rose again each year. Is not Christ simply another corn king? Now, this brings us to the oddest thing about Christianity. In a sense, the view which I have just described is actually true. From a certain point of view, Christ is the same sort of thing as Adonis or Osiris, always, of course, waiving the fact that they lived nobody knows where or when, while he was executed by a Roman magistrate we know in a year which can be roughly dated. And that is just the puzzle. If Christianity is a religion of that kind, why is the analogy of the seed falling into the ground so seldom mentioned? Twice only, if I mistake not, in the New Testament. So if he is a corn king, if it does come from this, why do the authors of this story shy away from mentioning it? They only mention it twice. Whereas with Adonis or Osiris, not only is it mentioned many times, it's the central theme of the story. With Christ, it's mentioned twice and only in an offhanded way. So it's for a theme that's for a myth that's based on those stories, that's based on even the patterns of the world around us, it's not mentioned very much. It's not really getting the play you would think it deserves if, in fact, Christ is just another corn king.
I'm sorry. Why is it unique that it's mentioned? I don't know, less.
Because if it's the central theme of the story, as the Adonis Corn King myth and the Osiris Corn King myth are, then it's going to play a larger role. And if it's being derived from not just earlier myths like Adonis and Osiris, but also from the patterns exhibited in the world around us, because after all, communities in the past were far more near to farming than we are, right? So the patterns of farming and the patterns of birth and resurrection, death, birth, and resurrection. Excuse me, that's not the right way. Death and resurrection, that would be the right way to phrase that, would be present in the minds of the people who are writing this story. And therefore, the lack of mentions of this in the story itself seem a little bit strange. Wouldn't there be more?
Yes.
Wouldn't there be more prominence to the corn myth, to the corn king myth? There'd be a larger emphasis on it. And it's not like they were trying to hide it. I mean, after all, Lewis is talking about people who write books about comparative religion. They've looked at religion from a macro perspective, right? They've looked at religion from the standpoint of history, looking back tens of thousands of years. The people who are writing the Christ myth, they're not trying to distinguish themselves from other corn king myths. I mean, after all, they probably don't even know of other corn king myths. So the idea that they would be trying to hide it is also hard to believe. The impression they make is that of men who simply don't know how close they are to the corn religions, men who simply overlook the rich sources of relevant imagery and association which they must have been on the verge of tapping at every moment. If you say they suppressed it because they were Jews, that only raises the puzzle in a new form. Why should the only religion of a dying God, which has actually survived and risen to unexampled spiritual heights, occur precisely among those people to whom, and to whom almost alone, the whole circle of ideas that belonged to the dying God was foreign? So they didn't have there was nothing like this in their religion. Right? The Jews had nothing of a dying God in their religion. The gods around them did, right? The civilizations around them had dying gods. In fact, they were very, very common. The idea of a god that dies at one part of the year and comes back to life at another part of the year. This is very, very common. So he said, well, if you say it's because they're Jews, and by saying that, I assume he means because they're religious people. Well, why would a people that have no dying God in their religion create something with a dying God in it? Not only did they not have it as a part of their traditional of their traditions, it was anathema to them. They didn't like it. They didn't have. It was hateful to them. Something odious. In fact, it was considered a sort of sacrilege to talk that way, to look at God that way, because those are the way the communities around them, the polytheistic systems around them looked at God. We don't look at God like that. We have the one true God. This is how the Jews.
It's a huge break.
It's a huge break from the norm. It's a huge break from their mores, their traditions. So, attributing their the story to just the fact of their Jewishness really doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. I myself, who first seriously read the New Testament when I was, imaginatively and poetically, all agog for the death and rebirth pattern, and anxious to meet a corn king, was chilled and puzzled by the almost total absence of such ideas in the Christian documents. One moment particularly stood out. A dying God, the only dying God who might possibly be historical, holds bread, that is, corn, in his hands and said, "This is my body." Surely here, even if nowhere else, or surely if not here, at least in the earliest comments on this passage and through all later devotional usages in ever-swelling volume, the truth must come out. The connection between this and the annual drama of the crops must be made. But it is not. It is there for me. There is no sign that it was there for the disciples, or, humanly speaking, for Christ himself. It is almost as if he didn't realize what he had said. So at this moment in the gospel story, at the Last Supper, Christ looks at his disciples, takes bread in his hands, breaks up the bread, hands it out to them, and says, "Take, eat, this is my body." Well, what is bread but corn or wheat? It's cereal, right? It comes from the cereals. This is a great moment, if he's a corn king, to draw that connection and say, here is the corn king, right? Here's the exemplification of the corn king, the personification of the corn king. But no connection is made of it, not only in the story itself, but even in later comments on the story by disciples directly after Christ's ascension into heaven. Right? No devotionals mention it either. No devotionals meaning instructions to Christians who are reading this in later generations. Right? Any commentaries on it in early commentaries of Christianity. Nobody mentions it. Seems kind of obvious. Seems kind of an obvious thing to miss if this is in fact a corn king religion. This is an obvious moment. This is a real close connection to a corn king, but no connection to it is made, not just by Christ, but by anybody after him. The records, in fact, show us a person who enacts the part of the dying God, but whose thoughts and words remain quite outside the circle of religious ideas to which the dying God belongs. The very thing which the nature religions are all about seems to have actually happened once, but it happened in a circle where no trace of nature religion was present. It is as if you met the sea serpent and found that it disbelieved in sea serpents, as if history recorded a man who had done all the things attributed to Sir Lancelot, but who had himself never apparently heard of chivalry. There is, however, one hypothesis which, if accepted, makes everything else easy and coherent. The Christians are not claiming that simply God was incarnate in Jesus. They are claiming that the one true God is he whom the Jews worshipped as Yahweh, and that it is he who has descended. Now, the double character of Yahweh is this. On the one hand, he is the God of nature, her glad creator. It is he who sends rain into the furrows till the valleys stand so thick with corn that they laugh and sing. The trees of the wood rejoice before him, and his voice causes the wild deer to bring forth their young. Quoting Old Testament imagery here. He is the God of wheat and wine and oil. In that respect, he is constantly doing all the things that nature gods do. He is Bacchus, Venus, Ceres, all rolled into one. There is no trace in Judaism of the idea found in some pessimistic and pantheistic religions that nature is some kind of illusion or disaster, that finite existence is in itself an evil, and that the cure lies in the relapse of all things into God. Compared with such anti-natural conceptions, Yahweh might almost be mistaken for a nature god. So we see this with pantheistic religions, that nature itself is evil, that it's some sort of corruption, and that the way to get back to God, the way to bring about our proper state, our our fulfillment, is to um, is for all things to relapse or go back to a oneness or connectedness with God. We see this in Buddhism, right? Where the desire there is to lose oneself, to lose one's identity, to lose one's individuality, to relapse into God. And this isn't what we see in Christianity. This isn't what we see in the Old Testament either. We see a lot of, we see a rejoicing in nature itself. The fact that God created it and the fact that he brings the rains. The fact that he created it and the fact that the deer give birth because of him. Nature is looked at in almost worshipful terms without worshiping it. All of the imagery, all of the poetry of the Old Testament is a celebration of nature, not looking at it as an evil. Even though people in that day, even today, but obviously much more in times past, were much closer to its dangers. They were very close to the dangers of nature. They weren't protected from its predations like we are. We live a very curated life in with respect to how dangerous nature is. We don't really feel that danger as much as people did in the past. We look at nature almost as something beautiful and scenic, but really, if we were exposed to it without the modern amenities, it's trying to kill us all the time, right? Nature is always trying to kill us. Even with that connection to that danger in nature, in the Old Testament, you see a celebration of nature. You see a joy in nature that isn't there in pantheistic religions. Nature is looked at as an evil thing, something we need to separate ourselves from. What does Buddhism say? All life is suffering. This is its first principle. The first noble truth is all life is suffering, and the cause of suffering is desire. That's the second noble truth. So, in that, from those first principles, you can see why the Buddha goes to on to live the ascetic life that he does, trying to separate himself from desires themselves, even the desires of that come about because you have a relationship with someone that you love. On the other hand, Yahweh is clearly not a nature god. He does not die and come to life each year as a true corn king should. He may give wine and fertility, but must not be worshipped with bacchanalian or aphrodisiac rites, that is, sexual or orgiastic rites, which is what Bacchus and many of the nature gods, that's how they were worshipped. They were worshipped with sort of a celebration of sex, or a celebration through sex. He is not the soul of nature, nor of any part of nature. He inhabits eternity. He dwells in the high and holy place. Heaven is his throne, not his vehicle. Earth is his footstool, not his vesture. One day he will dismantle both and make a new heaven and earth. He is not to be identified even with the divine spark in man. He is God and not man. His thoughts are not our thoughts. All our righteousness is filthy rags. So you can see the separation here, right? It's not God is respectful of and glorified in nature, but he's distant from it. He's separate from it. God is has his mark on all of us, but he's separate from us. We're connected, but the distance between us is infinite.
Yeah.
All our righteousness is filthy rags is a great example of that. His appearance to Ezekiel is attended with imagery that does not borrow from nature, but it is a mystery too seldom noticed, from those machines which men were to make centuries after Ezekiel's death. The prophet saw something suspiciously like a dynamo. and Lewis has a footnote at the end of this page that says he owes this point to Canon Adam Fox, who I have no knowledge of, but he says if you when you read Ezekiel's vision of God, the prophet Ezekiel says that God looked that what he saw looked like a wheel within a wheel, which is what a dynamo is. It says it looks suspiciously like a dynamo. Ezekiel doesn't draw any relationships to nature, though. He doesn't say it looked like a lion or it looked like an eagle or it looked like. He doesn't draw any natural relationships there. So God, the creator of all nature, even for the Jews, the connection between him and natural things was never made. It's distant. He's separate from it, even though he's the creator of it, right? Uh, this lowering of God to that level never really occurred. Yahweh is neither the soul of nature nor her enemy. She is neither his body nor a declension and falling away from him. She is his creature. He is not a nature god, but the God of nature, her inventor, maker, owner, and controller. To everyone who reads this book, the conception has been familiar from childhood. We therefore easily think it is the most ordinary conception in the world. If people are going to believe in a God at all, we ask, what other kind would they believe in? But the answer of history is almost any other kind. We mistake our privileges for instincts, just as one meets ladies who believe their own refined manners to be natural to them. They don't remember being taught. You and I have talked about this a lot, about how there's a lot of things that are, to use a very tired phrase, taken for granted, about our morals, our sense of justice, our sense of individuality, maybe even, certainly even our value of the individual as um, a being that deserves rights, that deserves justice, that deserves some sort of hearing. This is what our legal system is based on. This is something we take for granted. It's a historical anomaly. It didn't. It's new, very new, and novel for sure. When we are examining, like when Lewis is looking at sort of the landscape of the gods throughout history, because we've been raised in a monotheistic system, and from the crib have heard about God spoken as one entity that's separate from nature, that created nature, that isn't um, um, prefigured in nature or isn't to be worshipped through nature. It seems natural to us that people would believe in a God like that they would believe in a monotheistic God that's distinct from nature. But historically speaking, the answer to what kind of God are people most natural to believe in, or are people most likely to believe in, the answer was almost any other kind of God than this monotheistic God that we're used to. The God that they're most likely to believe in, the God they're most likely to worship, and the ways in which they're most likely to worship that God are definitely through nature, and represented by things in nature also. A calf, for example, I mean, that's the one that's familiar to many Christians because of the golden calf that was made by Aaron, the children of Israel, but also any worshiping of nature's processes also. So we've talked about the corn king a lot. We're worshiping a process there, the birth, the resurrection and the death of the corn each year in the spring and the fall, the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, all of the tides, even the changing of the seasons. These things are processes of nature that get deified and worshipped as things, as gods in themselves, right? So this is one of the reasons I think that when Paul is talking to the churches in all of his letters, he talks about Christianity as a mystery and as a thing that is almost an object of scorn. When they go and tell people about Yahweh, the Jewish God made man in Christ and who died and was resurrected, and died in a particular way that everybody in that time would see as the most ignominious way to die, the most shameful way to die, which was to be crucified. When they told people that and said, this is the God, that created all things, created you, and loved you enough to die on the cross for you and be raised again. This probably is what came off to people as so strange, as so weird, because the gods they were used to was anything but that kind of God. The gods they were used to was, first of all, the gods they were used to was not a monotheistic God. It was a God among many other gods, right? Um, it was a nature God, maybe not a corn king per se, but a nature God, some God represented by nature or worshipped through nature, or through nature's writs, or through nature's processes, or through nature's events like spring or fall. But also, it was a God thrown down from the heights that they were used to seeing gods on. All of their gods were heroes. They were conquerors. They were strong. They were gods that put down other gods and that crushed the weak under their feet. This was a God who became weak for the purpose of saving mankind and reconciling him. This didn't resonate. So Lewis here is saying, if we were to ask this question, well, if people are going to believe in a God at all, what other kind would they believe in? The presumption there is being held by someone who's been raised in a monotheistic culture. Of course, you would believe that. You've been raised in it. Just like good ladies think that their refined manners are natural. They don't remember being unrefined. They don't remember being trained. They don't remember being taught how to act. They don't remember. Really, none of us do. We assume that our manners and our even our maybe our honesty and our reluctance to violence, all of these things are, well, they're obvious. I mean, anybody should adopt these ways of being, but we don't remember being taught this. We don't remember being taught as children that you can't hit somebody that you're sitting with. You can't, that you need to share, that you need to be courteous, that you need to be concerned with other people in the room and not just yourself. We don't remember being taught those things. All those things were beat into us, in a real way. So it's same with the God and the system of belief that, or the way we see the world, rather. That's been trained into us. We've been swimming in that ocean for a long time, and we don't realize there's the historical answer to what kind of God would people naturally believe in, anything but the monotheistic God that we're used to. Lewis goes on to say, now if there is such a God, and if he descends to rise again, then we can understand why Christ is at once so like the Corn King and so silent about him. He is like the Corn King because the Corn King is a portrait of him. Corn King is the copy. Christ is not the copy, is what he's saying here. The similarity is not in the least unreal or accidental, for the Corn King is derived, though through human imagination, from the facts of nature, and the facts of nature from her creator. The death and rebirth pattern is in her because it was first in him. On the other hand, elements of nature religion are strikingly absent from the teaching of Jesus and from the Judaic preparation, which led up to it, precisely because in them nature's original is manifesting itself. In them you have from the very outset God in behind nature religion and behind nature herself, where the real God is present and the shadows of that God do not appear. That which the shadows resembled does. The Hebrews, throughout their history, were being constantly headed off from the worship of nature gods. Not because the nature gods were in all respects unlike the God of nature, but because at best they were merely like, and it was the destiny of that nation to be turned away from likeness and to the thing itself. It's not that the nature religions, it's not that the Corn King is completely inaccurate. It does have a shadow of God cast on it. But it's not God himself. This is why Christ can come so close to, Lewis says, this is why Christ can come so close to the nature God, Corn King likeness without actually ever talking about it or stumbling into it or falling into it at the points where you would expect him to in the story. One of the examples he gave is Christ at the Last Supper talking to the disciples. He says, "Take, eat, this is my body." Well, here, if there was any situation, as Lewis says, where you would expect the Corn King elements to be present, it would be at this moment. Christ is literally offering corn to the disciples and saying, eat, this is me, this is my body. But there's nothing about it at all, right? Completely separate from it. Because the corn kings and the nature religions were shadows of God, but not God himself. So when the actual God shows up, there's going to be nothing of those facsimiles, nothing of those copies in the original story. The original story doesn't require any of that.
Now, what was Jesus? What did Jesus mean when he would tell them, when he told the disciples, "Eat, that this is my body"? What did he mean by that exactly?
Well, at the Last Supper, the disciples or Christ is showing the disciples how the celebration and the remembrance of his death, because he said, "Do this in remembrance of me."
Mm-hmm.
He's showing them in the commemoration of that, to remember what has redeemed them. Right, the redemption is what Christ is about to go through. The Last Supper happens just before he's arrested later that evening by the Romans and taken to be crucified. So this moment, this Last Supper is a practice, a ritual that later Christians are going to go through whenever they are going through a remembrance of or a commemoration of what Christ did. So the Last Supper is that. It's a remembrance of what Christ did. Lewis goes on to say the mention of that nation, Israel, turns our attention to one of those features in the Christian story which is repulsive to the modern mind. To be quite frank, we do not at all like the idea of a chosen people. Democrats by birth and education, we should prefer to think that all nations and individuals start level in the search for God, or even that all religions are equally true. It must be admitted at once that Christianity makes no concessions at this point of view. It does not tell of a human search for God at all, but of something done by God for, to, and about man. And the way in which it is done is selective, undemocratic to the highest degree. After the knowledge of God had been universally lost or obscured, one man from the whole earth, Abraham, is picked out. He is separated, miserably enough, we may suppose, from his natural surroundings, sent into a strange country, and made the ancestor of a nation who are to carry the knowledge of the true God. Within this nation there is further selection. Some die in the desert. Some remain in Babylon. There is further selection still. The process grows narrower and narrower, sharpens at last into one small bright point, like the head of a spear. It is a Jewish girl, at her prayers. All humanity, so far as it concerns its redemption, has narrowed to that. So here we have Mary, at her prayers, and the angel comes and says, "This is what I'm going to do with you, right? You're going to be the vehicle for the Messiah to come into the world." So there's a great deal of separating off and selection going on there. Lewis says that because we are raised to be Democrats in how we view things, we view democracy as the highest form of government and the best form of government, and it probably is. But this doesn't mean that this is the way God approaches what's good, what's selected, what's valued. There's a great deal of waste, at least from our own perspective, in how God handles things. Are all religions the same? Are they all valuable? Are they all man's search for God? Lewis is really playing on that hard. No, and Christianity is unsympathetic to that claim. It makes no bones about it. No, all religions are not the same. All man is not searching for God. God is doing something to man, about man, for man. Man isn't climbing up and grasping his way towards God. That's not what you see in Christianity. It's not what you see in the Old or the New Testament. It's man needing to be redeemed. So all religions aren't the same. If that's the claim, Christianity stands against that. But also, even among the nations, all nations aren't the same. Israel is selected. You're the chosen people. But even among that group, not all of the tribes are the same. Judah is going to be the tribe that Christ comes through, not the other 11 tribes. And not even all families are the same in Judah. It's David's family that's separated off even from that and says, you'll be who Christ comes through.
Mm.
The line of kings will come is David's line, and then further down that line, Christ comes through that line. And even among that family, it's narrowed down to one girl. At her prayers, all humanity rests in this moment, at least as far as its redemption is concerned, as Lewis says. So there's a great deal of narrowing and selection going on. Abraham's selected out of all people on the planet, right? And he says miserably enough because Abraham's taken out of a city, a city in Mesopotamia, an ancient city in Mesopotamia that it wouldn't look cosmopolitan to our eyes, but it was definitely cosmopolitan back then. It was fancy. It was comfortable. It was refined. It was the place to be. And Abraham's told, leave, go out into the wilderness. This is not a great thing for him. I'm sure it was very uncomfortable, and I'm sure he did not want to do it. So this is, Lewis is pointing out here, we're accustomed to a democratic view of things. God is not necessarily hemmed in by those democratic concerns. Such a process is very unlike what modern feeling demands, but it is startlingly like what nature habitually does. Selectiveness, and with it we must allow enormous wastage, is her method. Out of enormous space, a very small portion is occupied by matter at all. Most of the universe is completely unoccupied by matter. There's nothing in it. It's empty. Of all the stars, perhaps very few, perhaps only one, have planets. We know that. Of course, Lewis is writing this at a time when they didn't realize that there were more planets around other stars, but his point is the same, and it's still valid. Of all the stars, perhaps very few, perhaps only one, have planets. Of the planets in our own system, probably only one supports organic life. In the transmission of organic life, countless seeds and spermatozoa are emitted. Some few are selected for the distinction of fertility. Among the species, only one is rational. Within the species, only a few attain excellence, beauty, strength, or intelligence. It's a huge amounts of wastage here, right? A tremendous amount of space, only a very, very small portion of it contains matter. Tremendous amount of planets, only a very few can support life. Maybe only one, we don't know. Probably there are more, but even if there are more, they're a very small number compared to the ones that can't. Of the ones that can support life, only a few support intelligent life. Of the intelligent, of the rational, only one is rational. Of all these species on Earth, only one is rational, man. And of the rational, only a few achieve beauty, strength, or intelligence. Excellence. Most people are unremarkable. And I know that will chafe on our democratic ears too, but
maybe even some Christians' ears.
Yes. And when you that doesn't mean they're not valuable in God's eyes. That doesn't mean they're not
valuable to their families.
It doesn't mean it doesn't mean any of that. It just means that like if we were going to say excellence at a thing, right? Excellence at an art form, let's say. Excellence at a physical display, whatever it is. Excellence at writing or at storytelling, something like that. Very, very few achieve any form of excellence. Very few. Most people achieve nothing like that. And again, that doesn't mean their lives aren't valuable and that they're not valuable to people in their lives and that they're not infinitely valuable to God because Christ died for them. Yeah. But
we can admit that there are some that, what would you say,
live and die unremarkably. At this point, we come perilously near the arguments of Butler's famous analogy. I say perilously because the argument of that book very nearly admits parodying in the form, you say that the behavior attributed to the Christian God is both wicked and foolish, but it is no less likely to be true on that account, for I can show that nature, which he created, behaves just as badly. To which the atheist will answer, and the nearer he is to Christ in his heart, the more certainly he will do so. If there is a God like that, I despise and defy him. So if there is a God that participates in all this wasting, in this selection, I stand up to him and spit in his face. And Lewis says, when someone says that, they are nearer to Christ than you imagine. But I am not saying that nature, as we now know her, is good. That is a point we must return to in a moment. Nor am I saying that a God whose actions were no better than nature's would be a proper object of worship for any honest man. The point is a little finer than that. This selective or undemocratic quality in nature, at least insofar as it affects human life, is neither good nor evil. According as spirit exploits or fails to exploit this natural situation, it gives rise to one or the other. It permits, on the one hand, ruthless competition, arrogance, and envy. It permits, on the other, modesty and, one of our greatest pleasures, admiration. A world in which I was really, and not merely by a useful legal fiction, as good as everyone else, in which I never looked up to anyone wiser or cleverer or braver or more learned than I, would be insufferable. The very fans of the cinema stars and the famous footballers know better than to desire that. What the Christian story does is not to instate on the divine level a cruelty and wastefulness which have already disgusted us on the natural, but to show us in God's act, working neither cruelly nor wastefully, the same principle which is in nature also, though down there it works sometimes in one way and sometimes in the other. It illuminates the natural scene by suggesting that a principle which at first looked meaningless may yet be derived from a principle which is good and fair, may indeed be a depraved and blurred copy of it, the pathological form which it would take in a spoiled nature. So, we have a situation here where we are looking at a tremendous amount of waste. And we don't like nature for that reason. Marx said history uses men and then discards them. And he was proud of that. He saw that. He did not see that as something lamentable. He saw that as something merely to notice and to conform ourselves to. Okay, that'll tell you something about how Marx built his political system. History uses people and then discards them. Nature does this too, of course. It uses them and then discards them. Marx was wrong that history uses people and discards them, but we're right to look at nature as that way. Nature does do that. There's a lot of... Nature doesn't care, in other words, about individual... There's nothing in nature that can do any caring, right? There's no being there that feels and thinks and reasons. There are an endless chain of events, and that's all there is. If God is this way, the atheist rightly responds, if that's the God you're talking about, forget him. I'll spit in his face if he was standing right here. Because that God is a God that is not worthy of worship or admiration. And Lewis says, well, he's close to... The nearer to Christ he is in his heart, the more firmly and adamantly he will say this. Why? Because that man is desiring justice. That man is desiring truth. That atheist is desiring compassion as a laudable and admirable characteristic. That person is desiring justice and truth as admirable and laudable characteristics and goals. That's why. And you're close to Christ in that sense because these are the things that Christ has engendered in every heart. The desire for these things, the desire for compassion, the desire. Our world is very separate from the world, the ancient world that we've followed, we've come behind. In that world, we just talked about the kinds of gods that were worshipped. What kind of gods were worshipped by the ancients? They were gods that displayed enormous amounts of strength, that crushed their enemies. There are no mention in Homer's stories of downtrodden or oppressed peoples. Right? There are no mention of these types of characters in Homer's stories. There's no mention of those types of characters in any of the stories of the gods. The only people that are worthy of notice and repute are those who are strong. It's not those who are weak. Christ is the opposite. Christ engenders in us a love of, a care for, a concern for the weak. This is why Nietzsche hated God so much, or the Christian God, why he hated the Christian religion so much, because he felt it had robbed us. Nietzsche felt this. He felt it had robbed us, and particularly the German people, the northern peoples of Europe, that it had robbed them of their noble beastliness, as he saw it, their blonde beasts, as he phrased it. That it had castrated those people and turned them, these people who were once proud hunters. Again, this is his estimation. They were once proud hunters and conquerors into weak and feeble things.
Are
Right?
you saying that? Are you saying that Jesus taught us that it's not just the strong man that is the good man, that is the better man. All people,
That's one of the things.
all people, small and big, are equally great and worthy of God's love. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's exactly what I'm saying. Christ came to die for all. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is a key point in the Christian message, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is Christ's message. You all need me. He's talking to the Sadducees and the Pharisees, just like he talks to the harlot. You all need me. He talks to Pilate, a Roman official who has lots of power, the power to end his life, the same way that he talks to the cripple. You all need me. So everybody gets leveled in that sense, right? Not in the sense that, the collectivists and the communists would have everyone leveled, but in the sense that everyone is leveled before God.
Mm.
Everyone is leveled to the place where we're all equally missing the mark. That's what sin is. The word sin comes from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, like an archer missing a target when he fires at it. We're all missing the mark, and Christ comes to correct that, and even to show us what the mark is. Right? Not just to direct our arrow at the right place, but to show us what the mark is that we should be shooting at. So when the atheist responds, if that's the kind of God you're talking about, I'll spit in his face and I'll be damned if I'm going to serve a God like that. He really is echoing the desire that Christ has brought to, the revelation that Christ has brought to us, and the desire that is engendered in us over many generations, which is the desire for compassion, the desire for even the smallest, like the child that has spina bifida, right? That's born that way, or that has some sort of horrible, cancerous thing that I've never heard of, that I'm sure is absolutely horrid, eating away at the base of their brain and their spine. Something terrible. We're those kinds of people were set out on the rocks to die of exposure when they were born a few thousand years ago. That's not something we talk about when we make movies about Sparta and how awesome they were, but that's what they did. That was the world they lived in. We live in a very different world. We live in a world that says that's somebody you should care for and try to do as much for them as you can, despite the fact that they're never going to contribute anything. And that was probably one of the main reasons that they were set out on the rocks to die of exposure by the Spartans and other cultures like them, because that being was probably never going to contribute anything to the tribe. Knowing that, we still take care of this creature. So the atheist who wants that creature to be cared for is echoing Christ's love in his way. And the more firmly, the more adamantly he makes that declaration, Lewis is saying, the closer he is to Christ. And Lewis is saying, I'm not saying that's what God is. I'm not saying God is like nature in that sense, that he wastes, that he's willing, like Marx says, to use people and then discard them. I'm saying that principle in nature, that some things are narrowed down to where only a few things are really used and most things aren't, like space, like stars, like planets, like species on the planets. That process has a good version and a bad version. And the good version is evidenced in God and how he interacts with humanity. The bad version is the polluted version, is the one we see at work so often in nature. It's not always bad, but it sometimes is. Sometimes it's good because it can, as Lewis says, it can be something that espouses in us, what's he say here?
What are you looking for?
He says everything is indebted to everything else, sacrificed to everything else, dependent on everything else. And here, too, we must recognize that the principle is in itself neither good nor bad. The cat lives on the mouse in a way I think bad. The bees and the parasites. Excuse me, I'm reading a little bit ahead here, aren't I?
Yes,
Okay.
we left off here.
Yeah. Yeah, so on the previous page here, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a bit. He says on page 189, this selective or undemocratic quality in nature, at least insofar as it affects human life, is neither good nor evil. According as the spirit exploits or fails to exploit this natural situation, it gives rise to one or the other. It permits, on the one hand, ruthless competition, arrogance, and envy. So there's a bad aspect of that wastingness, right? It permits, on the other, modesty and, one of our greatest pleasures, admiration. So when someone does achieve excellence or beauty or intelligence, what's your response to that person if you're in the right place spiritually? It's to admire.
Mm-hmm.
It's to look up to. It's to uphold, right?
Want to copy.
It's to want to emulate, right? It's that desire to emulate is there. So there is a sense in which raising something up above everything else can engender the negative characteristics that he outlined here: ruthlessness, competition, arrogance, and envy. But on the other hand, there is the kind of raising someone up that allows us all to go, that's what I want to be like. That's who I want to be like. Those are the characteristics I want to emulate. So admiration and modesty even, right? Because the person who is lifted up, they're in the position of being corrupted by that lifting up. Modesty is the that's the beast they have to wrestle with, to be modest. But the rest of us, we can wrestle with this beast and go to be envious of that or to want to admire and to emulate that. So it's not all spoilage here, right? That's the aspect of it that is alive in God. But we see negative aspects of it alive in nature too.
Mm-hmm.
This wasting of most things and using of only a few things. In God, there's no discarding, as in Marx's God. Marx's God was history with a capital H. But in the Christian God, there's no wasting. There's no discarding. Excuse me. There is wasting from one perspective, but there's no discarding. There's no getting rid of and forgetting about. You can think of Stalin's enemies here, discarded. You can think of his friends that way too. They were all discarded. He goes on to say, for when we look into the selectiveness which the Christians attribute to God, we find in it none of that favoritism. There we go. We find in it none of that favoritism which we were afraid of. The chosen people are chosen not for their own sake, certainly not for their own honor or pleasure, but for the sake of the unchosen. Abraham is told that in his seed, the chosen nation, all nations shall be blessed. It's not separating in order to hold down everyone else. It's separating in order to be an example for everyone else to follow. In his seed, Abraham is told in Genesis chapter 12, all nations of the earth shall be blessed.
Oh, I see. I think
by raising up the nation as an example. And as Lewis points
the
out,
ultimate example coming from
in Christ.
The example.
Right. And
it'd be something to emulate, something worthy of emulating.
That's right. A guiding, a target to show the target and to show how to hit it. Now, this isn't, you look at the chosen people, it's not like being chosen was some great honor for them, or at least no great pleasure. It was a great honor, but it was no great pleasure. I mean, the Jews went through a lot and still go through
pressure, yeah.
Right. So it's not just like a slave plucked out of the fields and taken into the house where he could be comfortable. Yeah. I mean, if anything, they're put up on a pedestal in order to have things hurled at them. Right? being put up on a pedestal, as any great athlete will tell you, makes you a target as much as anything. Now, sure, it's fun. I mean, LeBron has his Ferraris, but he's also the subject of great ridicule, right? And everybody wants their best shot at him when they play him. Same, they'll talk about this in sports, and I'm a sports fan, so we've talked about this a lot. But when a team wins the championship, the very next year, everybody wants a shot at them. Every team that plays them is going to play that team as hard as they possibly can.
Yeah, they want to see them go down.
They want to see them go down, and they also want to show we can compete with this.
Yeah.
And maybe it's cheap to to draw a parallel to that, to the Jews being the chosen people, but it's not an unalloyed gift to be chosen. Right? There's some alloy in there. There's some labor, there's some pain. Probably more pain than honor. He goes on to say, the nation has been chosen to bear a heavy burden. Lewis says this. Their sufferings are great, but as Isaiah recognized, their sufferings heal others. On the finally selected woman falls the utmost depth of material on the finally selected woman falls the utmost depth of maternal anguish. Her son, the incarnate God, is a man of sorrows, quoting Isaiah here, the one man into whom deity descended. The one man who can be lawfully adored is preeminent for suffering. But, you will ask, does this much mend matters? Is not this still injustice, though now the other way round? Where at the first glance we accused God of undue favor to his chosen, we are now tempted to accuse him of undue disfavor. The attempt to keep up both charges at the same time had better be dropped. And certainly, we have here come to a principle very deeply rooted in Christianity, what may be called the principle of vicariousness. The sinless man suffers for the sinful, and, in their degree, all good men for all bad men. And this vicariousness, no less than death and rebirth or selectiveness, is also a characteristic of nature. Self-sufficiency, living on one's own resources, is a thing impossible in nature's realm. Everything is indebted to everything else, sacrificed to everything else, dependent on everything else. And here, too, we must recognize that the principle is in itself neither good nor bad. The cat lives on the mouse in a way I think bad. The bees and the flowers live on one another in a more pleasing manner. The parasite lives on its host, but so also the unborn child on its mother. In social life, without vicariousness, there would be no exploitation or oppression, but also no kindness or gratitude. It is a fountain both of love and hatred, both of misery and happiness. When we have understood this, we shall no longer think that the depraved examples of vicariousness in nature forbid us to suppose that the principle itself is of divine origin. At this point, it may be well to take a backward glance and notice how the doctrine of incarnation is already acting on the rest of our knowledge. We have already brought it into contact with four other principles: the composite nature of man, the pattern of descent and reascension, selectiveness, and vicariousness. The first may be called a fact about the frontier between nature and supernature. The other three are characteristics of nature herself. And the first, of course, is the composite nature of man. That's a fact about the frontier between nature and supernature, which we talked about very early in the book. He says there's this frontier between nature and supernature, this borderland. And man is a composite of both of those things. Nature because of the material aspect of us, supernature because of the spiritual and reasonable aspect of ourselves. But then the other three that he talks about here, the pattern of descent and reascension, selectiveness and vicariousness, those three things there are patterns in nature. They're not just a pattern of nature and supernature, they're a pattern just of nature. Now, most religions, he says, when brought face to face with the facts of nature, either simply reaffirm them, give them just as they stand a transcendent prestige, or else simply negate them, promise us release from such facts and from nature altogether. The nature religions take the first line. They reaffirm these patterns that we talked about. right? In fact, they go on to worship those patterns. The nature religions do. They worship those patterns because they worship the harvest. They worship the planting. That's the descent and reascension. They're worshiping that process. They worship the selectiveness. The heroes are raised up. Everybody else is lower, right? They worship that part of it. That's what the nature religions do. Other religions negate it and promise us release from it. You can think of Buddhism here. You're going to be released from this suffering. This suffering, there's no answer to it. There's no sense denying it, but there is someday a release from it.
Is that loose connection? Would they fall under what would you say, a mystic title? Their loose connections to a god or a divine thing. Would you?
I mean, there's definitely some mystic elements there. Buddhism typically falls under the banner of a pantheistic religion, because God kind of becomes everything in Buddhism. But there are definitely mystic elements for sure. It also depends on what era of Buddhism you're talking about, because it's changed a lot over the years. So he says that most religions, when brought face to face with the facts of nature, either simply reaffirm them, give them just as they stand a transcendent prestige, or else simply negate them, promise us release from such facts and from nature altogether. The nature religions take the first line. They sanctify our agricultural concerns, and indeed our whole biological life. We get really drunk in the worship of Dionysus, and lie with real women in the temple of the fertility goddess. In life force worship, which is the modern and Western type of nature religion, we take over the existing trend towards development of increasing complexity in organic, social, and industrial life and make it a god. So the development of nature, the development of society, the weeding out of cultures less fitted to survive. You can think of the Nazis here, or even of some elements of French philosophy in the late 19th century or early 20th century, worshiping the life force, right? Worshiping the refined, evolutionarily refined version of man, which is what Nietzsche was after, which is what Hitler was after. You can think of that as sort of a modern nature religion, because they're worshiping the biological aspects of man. The anti-natural or pessimistic religions, which are more civilized and sensitive, such as Buddhism or higher Hinduism, tell us that nature is evil and illusory, that there is an escape from this incessant change, this furnace of striving and desire. Neither the one nor the other sets the facts of nature in a new light. So neither the ones that worship nature's processes, nor the ones that promise us release from those processes, puts nature in a new light. The nature religions merely reinforce that view of nature, which we spontaneously adopt in our moments of rude health and cheerful brutality. The anti-natural religions do the same for the view we take in moments of compassion, fastidiousness, or lassitude. The Christian doctrine does neither of these things. If any man approaches it with the idea that because Yahweh is the God of fertility, or lasciviousness is going to, if any man approaches it with the idea that because Yahweh is the God of fertility, our lasciviousness is going to be authorized, or that the selectiveness and vicariousness of God's method will excuse us for imitating, as heroes, supermen, or social parasites, the lower selectiveness and vicariousness of nature, he will be stunned and repelled by the inflexible Christian demand for chastity, humility, mercy, and justice. So in selectiveness, we see many beings cast aside as meaningless. Only a few are raised up. Right? In vicariousness, we see exploitation. The parasite living off of the host. One species preying on another. The cat with the mouse, you can think of that. The lion with the zebra. One species is preying on another, or there's a vicarious element there. And even though there are things about God that you could call vicarious or selective, you will not find those things as in Christianity as a license to be, even though God is the God of fertility, lascivious, sexually promiscuous. You'll be stunned at that if you come to Christianity with that idea. You won't find an authorization of selectiveness to elevate some and suppress everyone else, or a vicariousness to prey on some, like a predator.
Hmm.
What you will find there is a demand for chastity, so not lasciviousness, humility, so not selectiveness where one person is elevated up and everyone else is suppressed, and mercy and justice, so not being able to, one group or one person being able to prey on others. On the other hand, if we come to it regarding the death which precedes every rebirth, or the fact of inequality, or our dependence on others, and their dependence on us, as the mere odious necessities of an evil cosmos, and hoping to be delivered into transparent and enlightened spirituality, where all these things just vanish, we shall be equally disappointed. We should be told that, in one sense, and despite enormous differences, it is the same all the way up. That hierarchical inequality, the need for self-surrender, the willing sacrifice of self to others, and the thankful and loving, but unashamed acceptance of others' sacrifice to us, hold sway in the realm beyond nature, in heaven too. It is indeed only love that makes the difference. All those very same principles which are evil in the world of selfishness and necessity are good in the world of love and understanding. Thus, as we accept this doctrine of the higher world, we make new discoveries about the lower world. It is from that hill that we first really understand the landscape of this valley. Here, at last, we find, as we do not find either in the nature religions or in the religions that deny nature, a real illumination. Nature is being lit up by a light from beyond nature. Someone is speaking who knows more about her than can be known from inside her. So, we're not promised release. So we're not told to worship the processes of nature like the nature religions do, and we're also not promised release like most of the other kinds of religions. Because Lewis said there are primarily two types of religions that have sprung up to answer the question about nature. Because nature is harsh and cruel and demanding, and there's lots and lots of suffering. How to answer that, how to deal with that. One group of religions says, worship it. Worship the predatory, selective vicariousness of nature. Another group of religions, and most religions fall into these two groups, another group of religions says there will someday be release from all of this suffering. You'll be freed from it. Christianity offers neither of these things. It doesn't say worship the processes. In fact, it says that would be blasphemy. It doesn't say there will be a release from it. In fact, it says even in heaven, these processes will be there. That the structure, the hierarchy of some beings elevated over others will be there in heaven, just as it is in nature. It says that this descent in order to reascend will be there too.
A hierarchy in heaven, huh?
A hierarchy in heaven, right? But there will be a hierarchy there too. Some saints will be more privileged. Can we say that? Or
no, I think
some saints will be elevated over others.
Who was it? Was it a disciple or was it Jesus himself who said that there would be a certain individual that'd be on his left or right?
Yeah, it was James and John asked this of their mother. Asked Jesus, grant that these two will be able to sit at your left and right hand when you come into your kingdom. And he says, you don't know what you're asking, right? You think this is going to be some great honor. You don't know what you're asking. But yeah, there will be. There will be some elevated above others. Even among the angels, there are levels. So that pattern isn't going to be, we're not going to be released from that, as Buddhism would offer. In fact, there will be a reaffirmation of it, just in the purer form and the higher note. Throughout this doctrine, it is, of course, implied that nature is infested with evil. Those great key principles which exist as modes of goodness in the divine life take on in her operations not merely a less perfect form, that we should on any view expect, but forms which I have been driven to describe as morbid or depraved. So those patterns that are with God good are not just a less perfect form in nature, but a depraved or a morbid form. They've been polluted. And there's evidence of this in the Christian doctrine. He says, and this depravity could not be totally removed without the drastic remaking of nature. Complete human virtue could indeed banish from human life all the evils that now arise in it from vicariousness and selectiveness, and retain only the good. But the wastefulness and painfulness of non-human nature would remain, and would, of course, continue to infect human life in the form of disease. And so even if all of mankind was fully virtuous, we would still have to contend with nature, its pains, its deprivations, and its diseases. Even if we were no longer preying on each other, which is probably the biggest source of pain in the world for humans, nature would still be at odds with us.
Entropy still exists.
Entropy would still be there. That's
and
right.
You could easily see how that would cause sadness. I mean, I don't want to see my mother go, and
right.
my children don't want to see
or
me
suffering
go.
in general.
Mm-hmm.
And the destiny which Christianity promises to man clearly involves a redemption or remaking of nature, which could not stop at man, or even at this planet. We are told that the whole creation is in travail. There's that evidence that I was talking about in the New Testament of this principle. We are told that, quote, the whole creation is in travail, end quote, and that man's birth will be the signal, and that man's rebirth, capital M there, so we know we're talking about Christ. We know that man's rebirth will be the signal for hers. Christ's rebirth, man as a whole, will be the signal for nature's rebirth also. In fact, it says that Paul says that nature, the whole creation, groans in travail. Groan in travail being like a woman groaning in birth as she's giving birth. Nature groans in travail, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Nature is looking for this to happen, looking for the sons of God to manifest themselves. This gives rise to several problems, the discussion of which puts the whole doctrine of the Incarnation in a clearer light. In the first place, we ask how the nature created by a good God comes to be in this condition. Well, if God is good, why did he create an evil nature? By which question we may mean either how she comes to be imperfect, to leave room for improvement, as the schoolmasters say in their reports, or else how she comes to be positively depraved. If we ask the question in the first sense, the Christian answer, I think, is that God, from the first, created her such as to reach her perfection by a process in time. He made an earth at first without form and void, and brought it by degrees to its perfection. In this, as elsewhere, we see the familiar pattern, descent from God to the formless earth, and reascent from the formless to the finished. In that sense, a certain degree of evolutionism, or developmentalism, is inherent in Christianity. So much for nature's imperfection. Her positive depravity calls us for a very different explanation. According to the Christians, this is all due to sin. The sin both of men and of powerful, non-human beings, supernatural, but created. Think of Satan here and his angels. The unpopularity of this doctrine arises from the widespread naturalism of our age, the belief that nothing but nature exists, and that if anything else did, she is protected from it by a Maginot Line, and will disappear as this error is corrected. To anyone listening, you'll have to excuse some sounds in the background. There's some construction going on in our area and just outside of this building, so sometimes those sounds are just going to have to interfere. He goes on to say here, to be sure, the morbid inquisitiveness about such beings, which led our ancestors to a pseudoscience of demonology, is to be sternly discouraged. Our attitude should be that of the sensible citizen in wartime, who believes that there are enemy spies in our midst, but disbelieves nearly every particular spy story. We must limit ourselves to the general statement that beings in a different and higher nature, which is partially interlocked with ours, have, like men, fallen and have tampered with things inside our frontier. The doctrine, besides proving itself fruitful of good in each man's spiritual life, helps to protect us from shallowly optimistic or pessimistic views of nature. To call her either good or evil is boys' philosophy. We find ourselves in a world of transporting pleasures, ravishing beauties, and tantalizing possibilities, but all constantly being destroyed, all coming to nothing. Nature has all the air of a good thing spoiled. The sin, both of men and of angels, was rendered possible by the fact that God gave them free will, thus surrendering a portion of his omnipotence. It is again a death-like or descending movement, because he saw that from a world of free creatures, even though they fell, he could work out, and this is the reascent, a deeper happiness, and a fuller splendor than any world of automata would admit.
That's beautiful.
Another question that arises is this: if the redemption of man is the beginning of nature's redemption as a whole, must we then conclude, after all, that man is the most important thing in nature? If I had to answer yes to this question, I should not be embarrassed. Supposing man to be the only rational animal in the universe, then, as has been shown, his small size and the small size of the globe he inhabits would not make it ridiculous to regard him as the hero of the cosmic drama. Jack, after all, is the smallest character in Jack the Giant Killer. Nor do I think it in the least improbable that man is, in fact, the only rational creature in this spatio-temporal nature. That is just a sort of lonely preeminence, just the disproportion between picture and frame, which all that I know of nature's selectiveness would lead me to anticipate. But I do not need to assume that it actually exists. Let man be only one among a myriad of rational species, and let him be the only one that has fallen. Because he has fallen, for him God does the great deed, just as in the parable it is the one lost sheep for whom the shepherd hunts. Let man's preeminence or solitude be one not of superiority, but of misery and evil. Then all the more, man will be the very species into which mercy will descend. For this prodigal, the fatted calf, or, to speak more suitably, the eternal lamb, is killed. You can think of the prodigal son story here. Who does the father kill the fatted calf for? Not the son that stayed and did the right thing. He kills the fatted calf for the one that's been rescued, that went out and lived a terrible life, that did evil and repented. But once the Son of God, drawn hither not by our merits but by our unworthiness, has put on human nature, then our species, whatever it may have been before, does become in one sense the central fact in all nature. Our species, rising after its long descent, will drag all nature up with it, because in our species the Lord of nature is now included. And it would be all of a piece with what we already know if 99 righteous races inhabited distant planets that circle distant suns, and needing no redemption on their own account, were remade and glorified by the glory which had descended into our own race. For God is not merely mending, not simply restoring the status quo. Redeemed humanity is to be something more glorious than unfallen humanity would have been. More glorious than any unfallen race now is, if at this moment the night sky conceals any such. The greater the sin, the greater the mercy. The deeper the death, the brighter the rebirth. And this superadded glory will, with true vicariousness, exalt all creatures, and those who have never fallen will thus bless Adam's fall. I write so far on the assumption that the Incarnation was occasioned only by the fall. Another view has, of course, been sometimes held by Christians. According to it, the descent of God into nature was not in itself occasioned by sin. It would have occurred for glorification and perfection even if it had not been required for redemption. Its attendant circumstances would have been very different. The divine humility would not have been a divine humiliation. The sorrows, the gall and vinegar, the crown of thorns and the cross would have been absent. If this view is taken, then clearly the Incarnation, wherever and however it occurred, would always have been the beginning of nature's rebirth. The fact that it has occurred in the human species, summoned thither by that strong incantation of misery and abjection which love has made himself unable to resist, would not deprive it of its universal significance. This doctrine of a universal redemption, spreading outwards from the redemption of man, mythological as it will seem to modern minds, is in reality far more philosophical than any theory which holds that God, having once entered nature, should leave her, and leave her substantially unchanged, or that the glorification of one creature could be realized without the glorification of the whole system. God never undoes anything but evil, never does good to undo it again. The union between God and nature in the person of Christ admits no divorce.
What does he mean by there? Maybe you could maybe I overthought it.
Which
God
part?
never undoes anything but evil. Never does good.
To undo it again.
It's good to do it under a game.
So what he's saying there is that the only unmaking God does is of the works of evil. The only repairing, the only disassembling that he does is of the things that are evil. Any good thing that is done, any good thing that he has done, he never undoes it. It goes on forever, whatever that good thing is.
Ah, could you say that about our ability to reason? Because our ability to reason does invade nature, does it not?
Mm-hmm.
So this evil that he undid, right? Entropy, the uh, um, this fight with nature, God has beaten.
Yes, death. He's beaten death.
Mm.
He will not go out of nature again, and she must be glorified in all ways with this miraculous union demands. When spring comes, it leaves no corner of the land untouched. Even a pebble dropped in a pond sends circles to the margin. The question we want to ask about man's central position in this drama is really on a level with the disciples' question: which of them was the greatest? It is the sort of question which God does not answer. If from man's point of view the recreation of non-human and even inanimate nature appears a mere byproduct of his own redemption, then equally for some remote, non-human point of view, man's redemption may seem merely the preliminary to this more widely diffused springtime, and the very permission of man's fall may be supposed to have had that larger end in view. Both attitudes will be right if they will consent to drop the words mere and merely. Where a God who is totally purposive and totally foreseeing acts upon a nature which is totally interlocked, there can be no accidents or loose ends, nothing whatever of which we can safely use the word merely. Nothing is merely a byproduct of anything else. All results are intended from the first. What is subservient from one point of view is the main purpose from another. No thing or event is first or highest in a sense which forbids it to be also last and lowest. The partner who bows to man in one movement of the dance receives man's reverence in another. To be high or central means to abdicate continually. To be low means to be raised. All good masters are servants. God washes the feet of men. The concepts we usually bring to the consideration of such matters are miserably political and prosaic. We think of flat, repetitive equality and arbitrary privilege as the only two alternatives, thus missing all the overtones, the counterpoint, the vibrant sensitiveness, the interinanimations of reality. The disciples they were debating among themselves, and Jesus asked them what they're arguing about, and they say, which one of us will be the greatest in the kingdom of God, in his service, in the gospel, whatever it was.
Mm. He just stumbled upon them talking about
He
this.
overheard them talking about it.
Mm.
And uh, it's the kind of question that God doesn't answer, Lewis says. The same kind of question um, about man's central position in this drama is the kind of question that God doesn't answer. The same kind of question about the disciples had about which one of us will be the greatest. Our central position or our subservient position in this play, this drama, Lewis says this isn't really even the right question, or it's not a question that has an answer, because what is subservient from one point of view is the main purpose from another. No thing or event is first or highest in a sense which forbids it to be also last and lowest. And I think the reason why this sort of grates on us, just like he said here, is because we look at these things from a political or a prosaic perspective. We bring our politics to all of these conversations. What's equal? What's raised higher or lower? Who has the most privilege or the least? Who has uh, which group is more favored? Which group less favored? These are questions with political overtones,
Mm.
and we bring our politics to that question. But for God, there is no politics. Politics is a necessity for us, but it's only a necessity because of our fallen nature. It's only a necessity because we're sinners. Founders of the United States understood this. Uh, James Madison wrote, "The government is a necessary evil." That If men were angels, we would need no government. If government were made up of angels, we would need no check on government. Government, I'm paraphrasing now, government is a commentary on how evil we really are. Because if the fact that it exists at all is proof of our limitedness, our malevolence. But because we need government, because that definitely isn't an argument against government, because we need government to organize ourselves, we're trained to think in the terms of civics, in the terms of bureaucracy, of administration, of meted out justice. And when we think about how God views something, how he even views the earth versus how he views other planets, how he views man versus other species that might exist, other species who may or may not have fallen and needed redemption, we bring our politics to that question. We bring our politics to almost all questions, and it's difficult to step off of those politics because it does dominate our lives so much. Even with our own children, we're wanting to make sure we treat them equally, without favoritism, and as noble a place that springs, I think, from a noble place, but mostly because we're just not God, and God doesn't have to think that way because he's not tainted, he's not biased, he's not
capable of missing the mark.
Right, and I should say he's when I said he's not biased, I should say he's not unjustly biased. Right, there is a bias there, but it's a bias toward all things that are good and true. And if there's a bias to have, it's that one. For this reason, Lewis goes on, I do not think it at all likely that there have been, as Alice Meynell suggested in an interesting poem, many incarnations to redeem many different kinds of creature. Here, we're still dealing with the idea that perhaps there are multiple species out there that live on different planets and have a relationship with God, and maybe some of them, maybe none of them fell. Maybe we're the only species that fell, and so we're the only species that needed redemption. Or maybe many species have fallen, right? And so the proposal here is that, well, did Christ have to, or did some figurement of Christ have to come down and save each one of these species, redeem each one of them, right? One sense of style, Lewis goes on, of the divine idiom rejects it. The suggestion of mass production and of waiting cues comes from a level of thought which is here hopelessly inadequate. If other natural creatures than man have sinned, we must believe that they are redeemed. But God's incarnation as man will be one unique act in the drama of total redemption, and other species will have witnessed wholly different acts, each equally unique, equally necessary, and differently necessary to the whole process, and each, from a certain point of view, justifiably regarded as the great scene of the play. To those who live in Act 2, Act 3 looks like an epilogue. To those who live in Act 3, Act 2 looks like a prologue. And both are right, until they add the fatal word, merely. Or else try to avoid it by the dullard supposition that both acts are the same. So you could say that Act 3 is merely the epilogue, or Act 2 is merely the prologue. If we drop the word merely here, we gain the meaning, right? Nothing is inconsequential. Everything is consequential because everything is intended from the beginning. It ought to be noticed at this stage that the Christian doctrine, if accepted, involves a particular view of death. There are two attitudes towards death which the human mind naturally adopts. One is the lofty view, which reached its greatest intensity among the Stoics, that death doesn't matter, that it is kind nature's signal for retreat, and that we ought to regard it with indifference. The other is the natural point of view, implicit in nearly all private conversations on the subject, and in much modern thought about the survival of the human species, that death is the greatest of all evils. Hobbes is perhaps the only philosopher who erected a system on this basis. The first idea simply negates, the second simply affirms our instinct for self-preservation. Neither throws any new light on nature, and Christianity countenances neither. So, the first view says death doesn't matter. It negates this instinct we have to preserve ourselves. death is irrelevant. The other view, Thomas Hobbes's view, is that death is the greatest of all evils and to be avoided at all costs. Now, it doesn't take much encouraging for people to already believe that, because death is pretty much viewed that way mostly by everybody. Christianity takes neither one of these tacks. It takes neither one of these views. He says the first idea simply negates, the second simply affirms our instinct for self-preservation. Neither throws any new light on nature, and Christianity countenances neither. It doesn't give any of them any quarter, any of those two views. Its doctrine is subtler, he goes on. On the one hand, death is the triumph of Satan, the punishment of the fall, and the last enemy. Christ shed tears at the grave of Lazarus and sweated blood in Gethsemane. The life of lives that was in him detested this penal obscenity, not less than we do, but more. It might be worth noting here, he says that Christ cried at the tomb of Lazarus, but the Greek word for, I shouldn't say but, I should say and, the Greek word for groaned in his spirit, which is what the New Testament says of Christ when he's at the tomb of Lazarus. He groaned in his spirit. The word groaned there implies anger. Anger at death. Almost like it was a thing turned wrong, a thing that has been spoiled unnecessarily, that death was the consequence of a thing that's been spoiled, life, that it didn't need to happen, and that he was angry at that fact.
Now, is life a representation of something? When you say life, do you mean
I mean, just
Jesus, or do you mean literally not dying since the beginning?
Literally not dying. That's what I mean. That this quenching of life was the thing he was angry at. That's why he says the life of lives that was in him detested this penal obscenity. Penal, like a penal institute where people are punished. This penal obscenity, not less than we do. He didn't detest this penal obscenity less than we do. He detested it more. On the other hand, he goes on, only he who loses his life will save it. We are baptized into the death of Christ, and it is the remedy for the fall. Death is, in fact, what some modern people call ambivalent. It is Satan's great weapon, and also God's great weapon. It is holy and unholy, our supreme disgrace, and our only hope. The thing Christ came to conquer, and the means by which he conquered. To penetrate the whole of this mystery is, of course, far beyond our power. If the pattern of descent and reascent is, as looks not unlikely, the very formula of reality, then in the mystery of death the secret of secrets lies hid. But something must be said in order to put the grand miracle in its proper light. We need not discuss death on the highest level of all. The mystical slaying of the Lamb before the foundation of the world is above our speculations. Nor need we consider death on the lowest level. The death of organisms, which are nothing more than organisms, which have developed no personality, does not concern us. Of it we may truly say, as some spiritually minded people would have us say of human death, that it doesn't matter. But the startling Christian doctrine of human death cannot be passed over. So we may be able to overlook all of this death in the organisms, the lower organisms that have no personality and have no reasoning and have no logic. We may be able to overlook that, and as the Stoics tell us to say, it doesn't matter. But
overlook it in a negative way?
No, just overlook it. We can overlook it and say it doesn't matter. All of that death doesn't matter. Because what is it that Christ is upset at death for? It's for the quenching of the life he came to save. He says, but the startling Christian doctrine of human death cannot be passed over. We can't just overlook that. We have to address it, take it head on. Human death, according to the Christians, is a result of human sin. Man, as originally created, was immune from it. Man, when redeemed and recalled to a new life, which will, in some undefined sense, be a bodily life, in the midst of a more organic and more fully obedient nature, will be immune from it again. This is the Christian doctrine. Man was originally created not to die. He then fell and did die. At some point in the future, and in some undefined way, it will be a bodily future. We will have a body. We will not die again. This doctrine is of course simply nonsense if a man is nothing but a natural organism, but if he were, then, as we have seen, all thoughts would be equally nonsensical, for all would have irrational causes. This is hearkening back way, way back to chapter 2 and 3 in this book, where he said, if man was merely a natural organism, it wouldn't just be thoughts about our potential immortality in the future that would be nonsense, because that would be nonsense if we were just a natural organism. It would also be all thoughts that would be nonsense, because all thoughts would be based on the ruthless determinism that confronts us in that case. We are unable to escape it. None of our thoughts are able to jump off of that line of imperturbable progress into the future, where we're connected to every event before us hopelessly. All of our thoughts would be connected to them also. We wouldn't be able to have an original thought. We wouldn't be able to have we wouldn't be able to make inferences, right? So it's not just thoughts like this that would be nonsensical, but also any thoughts would be nonsensical. He says, we've already gone over this. Man must therefore be a composite being, a natural organism tenanted by, or in a state of symbiosis with, a spiritual spirit, tenanted by, lived in, rented out by a spirit, much like you rent out a home or you're the tenant of an apartment. The Christian doctrine, startling as it must seem to those who have not fully cleared their minds of naturalism, states that the relations which we now observe between that spirit and that organism are abnormal or pathological ones. At present, spirit can retain its foothold against the incessant counterattacks of nature, both physiological and psychological, only by perpetual vigilance, and physiological nature always defeats it in the end. Sooner or later, it becomes unable to resist the disintegrating processes at work in the body, and death ensues. A little later, the natural organism, for it does not belong, excuse me, a little later, the natural organism, for it does not long enjoy its triumph, is similarly conquered by merely physical nature and returns to the inorganic. But on the Christian view, this was not always so. The spirit was once not a garrison, maintaining its post with difficulty in a hostile nature, but was fully at home with its organism, like a king in his own country, or a rider on his own horse, or better still, as the human part of a centaur was at home with the equine part. Where spirit's power over the organism was complete and unresisted, death would never occur. No doubt, spirit's permanent triumph over natural forces, which, if left to themselves, would kill the organism, would involve a continued miracle, but only the same sort of miracle which occurs every day. For whenever we think rationally, we are, by direct spiritual power, forcing certain atoms in our brain and certain psychological tendencies in our natural soul to do what they would never have done if left to nature. That's a pretty wild view there. In order to imagine a person who could live forever, as the Christian doctrine holds of people before the fall, we have to imagine a continued miracle occurring to hold that person in a state that defies entropy continually, right? Where we don't decay, where we don't age, where we don't grow old. Because our bodies are subject to this now.
Well, there were only two examples of humans that would never die, right? Adam and Eve.
Yes, but that would not be. But had they not fallen, they would not have been the only examples. Okay, so
yes,
so
of course.
We would have to imagine a situation where a continued miracle, a non-stop miracle, in other words, that maintained people in their state of non-decay would occur. But he says this is really no different from the miracle that occurs at every moment of our life. The more the better, actually, when we force atoms in our brain to move in a certain way to form certain conclusions. Right? This is that miracle that he's referencing, that original miracle that he's referencing in the beginning of this book, to talk about the ability of man to infer, the ability to reason. The Christian doctrine would be fantastic only if the present frontier situation between spirit and nature in each human being were so intelligible and self-explanatory that we just saw it to be the only one that could ever have existed. But is it? The reality of the frontier situation is so odd that nothing but custom could make it seem natural, and nothing but the Christian doctrine can make it fully intelligible. There is certainly a steady There is certainly a state of war, but not a war of mutual destruction. Nature, by dominating spirit, wrecks all spiritual activities. Spirit, by dominating nature, confirms and improves natural activities. The brain does not become less a brain by being used for rational thought. The emotions do not become weak or jaded by being organized in the service of a moral will. Indeed, they grow richer and stronger, as a beard is strengthened by being shaved, or a river is deepened by being banked. The body of the reasonable and virtuous man, other things being equal, is a better body than that of the fool or the debauchee, and his sensuous pleasures better simply as sensuous pleasures. For the slaves of the senses, after the first bait, are starved by their masters. Everything happens as if what we saw was not war, but rebellion. That rebellion of the lower against the higher, by which the lower destroys both the higher and itself. And if the present situation is one of rebellion, then reason cannot reject, but will rather demand the belief that there was a time before the rebellion broke out, and may be a time after it has been settled. And if we thus see grounds for believing that the supernatural spirit and the natural organism in man have quarreled, we shall immediately find it confirmed from two quite unexpected quarters. I don't know why. I guess I know why I think of this as because we talked about this earlier today. There is a sense from many people that the earth would be better if man wasn't in it. That somehow nature, unspoiled, is better off. Even the idea that we calling it, even the thought that it's or the label unspoiled is a deceiving one, because it sneaks in the idea that man is a poison. That he's some sort of despoiling force, and
that somehow we have less value
than
than.
than nature itself. Yeah, and
What a strange
it's
way
it's
to think.
perverse, and it's also deeply pagan. Right? It's deeply pagan because it looks at the earth as a living force. It looks at the earth as a almost like a virgin that's been raped or pillaged, plundered by
Defiled.
defiled, right, by some perverse and unnatural force, man, in this case. What you see coming through here in what Lewis is writing is that there is a state of war, but it's not a war of mutual destruction. Nature seeks to destroy.
Mhm.
And when I say nature seeks, it sounds like nature is a thinking, reasoning, acting being that organizes its activities like we organize our day. But that's really not the case. There's us trying to survive in nature, and there's nature not exactly being accommodating. So it's more, as Lewis says, it's more of a rebellion. But you can see where the good side is, if you want to put it that way. He says nature, by dominating spirit, wrecks all spiritual activities. When nature is superordinate, it wrecks any spiritual growth or development. A very simple example of this is, let's say you're planning out your day in the morning when you get up, and maybe you're brushing your teeth and thinking about what you're going to do, and you stub your toe. Immediately, all reasonable and calculated thought ceases to address the pain coming from your toe, and you may even curse. So nature invades and crushes this is a very simple example, but it invades and crushes that moment of reflection and um, reasoned calculation. It stops it in its tracks. But that's not what happens from the other direction. Reason doesn't destroy nature, it improves it. Nature only destroys reason. It doesn't improve it.
See, when I excuse me, when I think of nature coming in to invade, images of vines tearing down walls, right? The outside of a building comes to mind, right? Um, Cars rusting
Mm-hmm.
and and the like. You gave an example of stubbing your toe. Um, what exactly is nature in that example? Could you be a little
Nature,
more?
yeah, okay, that's a good question. Nature is in that situation, nature is the environment that you're in and the body you inhabit. And its demands, in that case, in the example we gave of pain, are so pressing that they stop any reasonable thought,
Okay.
right? In your example of rust with cars, vines destroying buildings, those are equally good examples because reason created the car, reason created the building. Engineering, math, an understanding of how to manipulate nature to make it more conformable to our needs and necessities. That's what made these objects. And nature tries to destroy them. Or it's its inevitable course to destroy them, right? So those are both reasonable examples. But notice that even in both of our examples, man, just qua man or man as man, is a positive force there, right? So you're planning out your day. Well, or the car that has been built, um, uh, in an attempt to make life more palatable or easier or more efficient, or maybe just to make it to where it's not so destructive, so that we can understand more things. The building is in the same situation. The building that would be destroyed by vines in your example. These are all things that are attempting to make our lives less painful, right? They're trying to preserve us. A life that is built just on that, just on trying to avoid pain. I think that's where you see a lot of people like Steven Pinker, right? They worship that and say, hey, look at all of this progress that's been made. And they're right to point to the progress because a tremendous amount has been made. In his book, Enlightenment Now, for example, he talks at length about this. But it's not comfort for comfort's sake, right? That's not all that's valuable, right? It's that comfort has to be geared towards something. It has to be animated by something, motivated towards something. The great scientific advancements that were made in the last 500 years were not made simply because people just wanted to be more comfortable. They understood that the world was a reasonable place. The world, by the world I mean the universe, however small they may have thought it was back then, and however big we think it is now, the universe in man's mind was an understandable place. And he went about, and why? Because there was a reasonable God that had made it, and he had created reasonable creatures, us, to inhabit it. So it was reason all the way up. It was reason with God at the top creating. It was a reason that ordered the universe by laws and understandable rules, and it was reason with the beings that inhabit it that are able to look upon it and say, here is order. And if I can just spend enough time, I can find that order. God created me this way. God created man that way. This was the assumption. But with that assumption removed, all you're left with is a bare materialism that only cares about the acquisition of goods. And that is sort of there is something objectionable about that. Now, it's better than people who think that all human beings should be wiped from the planet because nature is better off without us. I'll grant you that it is a better perspective, but it's an incomplete one, and it's not enough to hold off those people either. The idea that, well, look at how comfortable we've become over the last 500 years, and especially over the last 150 years, that's not enough to hold off the people who say, yeah, but we really don't have any purpose. We're clumps of cells that only seek our own, and um, look at this picture of Yosemite National Park. It sure is pretty without us in it. It's not enough to hold off those people because, as Jordan Peterson has said, when people are outside chanting with their signs, they don't say, when they say, "What do we want?" They'll claim something and then they'll say, "What do we want it?" They say now. But this is not quite what I'm about to say isn't quite as sexy of an idea. What do we want? Incremental improvement. When do we want it? In due course. That doesn't really have the chanting. That's not really a sexy chant. What do we want? Incremental improvement. When do we want it? In due course. It doesn't motivate people. It's it's the kind of planning, long-term thinking that humans aren't really known for. We're good at adapting. We're not good at predicting. And so there has to be some sort of higher purpose in order for us to see not only the world as a good place that we can transform with our reason, but also to not see ourselves as evil, to not see ourselves as despoiling agents. And I think Lewis is talking about that to some degree. We're properly construed, properly sharpened and motivated. We are a positive force because we're image bearers of God. Continuing on page 206, he says, almost the whole of Christian theology could perhaps be deduced from the two facts. A, that men make coarse jokes, and B, that they feel the dead to be uncanny. The coarse joke proclaims that we have here an animal which finds its own animality either objectionable or funny. That is kind of strange, the fact that we make coarse jokes and find them funny, especially about sex. Men will make more coarse jokes, in my experience, than women do about sex, and the fact that we find that funny is kind of itself puzzling. Why would we find our own coarseness to be funny, our own animality? Unless there had been a quarrel between the spirit and the organism, I do not see how this could be. It is the very mark of the two not being at home together, the animality and the spirit. They're not at home together. They find one another to be strange. But it is very difficult to imagine such a state of affairs as original. To suppose a creature which from the very first was half shocked and half tickled to death at the mere fact of being the creature it is. I do not perceive that dogs see anything funny about being dogs. I suspect that angels see nothing funny about being angels. Our feeling about the dead is equally odd. It is idle to say that we dislike corpses because we are afraid of ghosts. You might say with equal truth that we fear ghosts because we dislike corpses. For the ghost owes much of its horror to the associated ideas of pallor, decay, coffins, shrouds, and worms. In reality, we hate the division which makes possible the conception of either corpse or ghost, corpse being the natural part of man separated from the spiritual part, the ghost. We find a horror in that, the separation. Because the thing ought because the thing ought not to be divided, each of the halves into which it falls by division is detestable. The explanations which naturalism gives both of bodily shame and of our feeling about the dead are not satisfactory. It refers us to primitive taboos and superstitions, as if these themselves were not obviously results of the thing to be explained. But once accept the Christian doctrine that man was originally a unity, and that the present division is unnatural, and all the phenomena fall into place. It would be fantastic to suggest that the doctrine was devised to explain our enjoyment of a chapter in Rabelais, a good ghost story, or the tales of Edgar Allan Poe. It does so nonetheless. I ought perhaps to point out that the argument is not in the least affected by the value judgments we make about ghost stories or coarse humor. You may hold that both are bad. You may hold that both, though they result like clothes from the fall, are, like clothes, the proper way to deal with the fall once it has occurred. That while perfected and recreated, man will no longer experience that kind of laughter or that kind of shudder. Yet here and now, not to feel the horror and not to see the joke is to be less than human. But either way, the facts bear witness to our present maladjustment. And I love the way he approaches this, because he says you can find coarse jokes and horror of ghosts to be bad, right? That you shouldn't like coarse jokes, and you shouldn't find a horror in the separation of spirit and body. But you may say, well, if the fall had never happened, man would never be in this situation. He would have never found that coarseness to be funny, and he would have never had that horror of ghosts. Nevertheless, here we are. We're in this situation. And you may think that it's something like clothes. In Genesis, we see Adam and Eve naked, and they're not ashamed. They only cover themselves when they feel guilt. After they've sinned and they realize it, they immediately cover themselves. They cover their nakedness. And God comes marching through the garden and says, "Where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard you coming and I hid myself." Why? Because I'm naked. God says, "Who told you you were naked?" It's almost an accusatory tone that he takes. Who told you you were naked? Where did you get that idea? So he covers himself. So if our ability to recognize coarse jokes and even find them funny, and our ability to have a horror of the dead are bad, in the same way that clothes are bad and wouldn't have been needed had the fall not happened, they're probably also the best way to deal with the fall once it has happened. Just like clothes. We recognize that clothes are a way to deal with the fall. This is how Adam and Eve dealt with them, because they felt shame. Well, we're not going back into the garden. That's not going to happen. Clothes are the best way to deal with it post the fall. And coarse humor and horror of ghosts may be the best way to deal with that post the fall.
You're saying that could you be a little more specific there?
Well, all I'm saying is that he's drawing a parallel between what man was like before the fall and what he was like after. So man before the fall was naked and he was unashamed. And maybe before the fall also he would have found no humor in coarse jokes, and he would have found no horror in ghosts or in dead bodies. After the fall, he seems to. He seems to find humor in coarse jokes, and he seems to find horror, or seems to be possessed by horror when he's faced with death.
You're saying that we adapted to the unnatural.
Yeah, we adapted to our fallen state, right?
Okay.
And that our fallen state, one of the ways that Adam and Eve adapted to the fallen state was to clothe themselves, to hide their nakedness, and this was seen as appropriate, right? It's a mark of our own. It's an indictment of us. Our clothes are an indictment of us because we are fallen. And if we weren't fallen, we wouldn't feel guilt and we wouldn't clothe ourselves. But in that same way that we are dealing with our fallenness with clothes, we may also deal with our fallenness with coarse jokes and with horror of death. So much for the sense in which human death is the result of sin and the triumph of Satan, Lewis goes on. But it is also the means of redemption from sin. God's medicine for man and his weapon against Satan, death is, he said. In a general way, it is not difficult to understand how the same thing can be a masterstroke on the part of one combatant, and also the very means whereby the superior combatant defeats him. Every good general, every good chess player, takes what is precisely the strong point of his opponent's plan and makes it the pivot of his own plan. Take that castle of mine if you insist. It was not my original intention that you should. Indeed, I thought you would have had more sense. But take it by all means. For now, I move thus, and it is made in 3 moves. Something like this must be supposed to have happened about death. Do not say that such metaphors are too trivial to illustrate so high a matter. The unnoticed mechanical and mineral metaphors which in this age will dominate our whole minds, without being recognized as metaphors at all, the moment we relax our vigilance against them, must be incomparably less adequate. And one can see how it might have happened. The enemy persuades man to rebel against God. Man, by doing so, loses power to control that other rebellion which the enemy now raises in man's organism, both psychical and physical, against man's spirit. Just as that organism, in its turn, loses power to maintain itself against the rebellion of the inorganic. In that way, Satan produced human death. But when God created man, he gave him such a constitution that if the highest part of it rebelled against himself, it would be bound to lose control over the lower parts, i.e., in the long run, to suffer death. This provision may be regarded equally as a punitive sentence. In the day ye eat of that fruit, ye shall die, he quotes Genesis, as a mercy and as a safety device. It is punishment because death, that death of which Martha says to Christ, "But, sir, it'll smell," is horror and ignominy. I am not so much afraid of death as ashamed of it, said Sir Thomas Browne. This is a long paragraph, so I want to stop here and talk about it, because some of it can seem complicated, especially with my poor reading. Satan caused man to rebel in the story of Genesis. The result was death. But this doesn't mean that death wasn't part of God's plan. Perhaps Adam and Eve would never have died had they not eaten, right? But built into their organism was the provision that if they did rebel against God, they would die. And this was not a punishment, Lewis is saying. It was a mercy. Because imagine if they had rebelled against God and lived forever, a permanent state of rebellion. never to be quenched, never to be staunched, right? He likens it to playing chess with somebody. You took this castle. Well, actually, I didn't expect you to do that. I thought you would have been wiser. Because now that you have taken that, even though that wasn't part of my plan originally, that wasn't my original intention, that actually makes it easier for me. Because I move thus, and thus, and thus, and it's mate in 3 moves. It wasn't part of the original plan. I didn't think you were going to do that. I thought you would have been smarter than that. But I can incorporate that into the plan just fine, because I'm covered for that too. And this is something like this. He says, now you can call this a way of trivializing something that's a very high matter like death. But do you have a better option? Do you have a better explanation? This is something like this must have happened with Satan manipulating man into such a way that he did die, that he would die. He goes on to say, because and you can hear you can hear the horror, I guess, in Martha's voice when Jesus comes to see to his friend Lazarus, who's died, and he says, "Move the stone." Christ says, "Move the stone away from the grave." And Martha, Lazarus' sister, goes, "But Rabbi or Sir, he stinks. It'll smell." She has this horror of death, right? And she's almost repulsed by. She's definitely repulsed by not just the fact that he's dead, but also the fact that he's decayed. We often want to bury people before they decay and start to stink. And then he also quotes Sir Thomas Browne, who says, "I am not so much afraid of death as ashamed of it." It's not that I'm afraid of it. I'm embarrassed by the fact that I'm going to die. He goes on to say, it is mercy because by willing and humble surrender to it, man undoes his act of rebellion and makes even this depraved and monstrous mode of death an instance of that higher and mystical death, which is eternally good and a necessary ingredient in the highest life. So, submitting to death is how man ends his rebellion. That humility that he has to bring himself under, that willing and humble surrender, is what allows that rebellion to end, the rebellion that is in all man. The readiness is all, not, of course, the merely heroic readiness, but that of humility and self-renunciation. Our enemy, so welcomed, becomes our servant. Death, that is. Bodily death, the monster, becomes blessed spiritual death to self, if the spirit so wills. Or rather, if it allows the spirit of the willingly dying God so to will in it. So if the spirit of man will consent to death and allow the spirit of God to take over him, this becomes the means by which the rebellion is stopped. It is a safety device. He's talking about death here. It is a safety device because once man has fallen, natural immorality would be the one utterly hopeless destiny for him. Aided to the surrender that he must make by no external necessity of death, free, if you call it freedom, to rivet faster and faster about himself through unending centuries the chains of his own pride and lust and of the nightmare civilizations which these build up in ever-increasing power and complication, he would progress from being merely a fallen man to being a fiend, possibly beyond all modes of redemption. That's the person, that's the version of man that would have rebelled against God but never had to die. That's the thing he might have turned into. This danger was averted, Lewis says. The sentence that those who ate of the forbidden fruit would be driven away from the tree of life was implicit in the composite nature with which man was created. But to convert this penal death into the means of eternal life, to add to its negative and preventative function a positive and saving function, it was further necessary that death should be accepted. Humanity must embrace death freely, submit to it with total humility, drink it to the dregs, and so convert it into that mystical death which is the secret of life. But only a man who did not need to have been a man at all, unless he had chosen, only one who served in our sad regiment as a volunteer, yet also only one who was perfectly a man, could perform this perfect dying. And thus, which way you put it is unimportant, either defeat death or redeem it. He tasted death on behalf of all others. He is the representative, dyer of the universe, and for that very reason, the resurrection and the life. Or conversely, because he truly lives, he truly dies, for that is the very pattern of reality. Because the higher can descend into the lower, he who from all eternity has been incessantly plunging himself in the blessed death of self-surrender to the Father can also most fully descend into the horrible and, for us, involuntary death of the body. Because vicariousness is the very idiom of the reality he has created, his death can become ours. The whole miracle, far from denying what we already know of reality, writes the comment which makes that crabbed text plain. Or rather, proves itself to be the text on which nature was only the commentary. In science, we have been reading only the notes to a poem. In Christianity, we find the poem itself. So this is the first part of this page 211. He's talking about a version of man that would have never died. Eternal life, but also eternal rebellion. He says that in order to sort of stop this rebellion, humility in the face of death is what's required. Some sort of a surrender to it, right? There are people in the world who, they're called transhumanists, are the exact opposite of this, right? They are attempting quite literally to live forever. And I think they're the most evil people on the planet right now. They talk about it in little clubs where they meet in Switzerland, in places like Davos. They get together and try to design a world where our consciences will be downloaded onto a hard drive, our physical bodies discarded, so that our beings can go on living forever, whatever being is, because to them it's not really clear what it is. And in doing so, in being unwilling to submit to our own finality, our own, our own frailty, we're going to die. They become these extremely evil people who are nothing but a force for evil in the world. And they end up hating humanity along the way. This is the opposite of that. It's humility in the face of death. It's recognition that you will die, and that this is God's mercy, in fact, that you should die. To live forever in that rebelled state, that would be the real punishment.
Mm.
He goes on to say, with this,
just really quick, is that why I usually see some other place is mentioned, as opposed to heaven, right? A place of eternal rebellion, right? So we rebelled. To not die would be to live to live in eternal rebellion,
to become a fiend.
Yeah, and at some level, I think we're still living it out. And for those who choose to continue living it out, have a place for themselves.
Yeah, well, and this is something Lewis insists upon in his book, The Great Divorce. He says that he's drawing an analogy in that book of heaven and hell, and hell, in his analogy, is not a place where people are perpetually on fire, like you would think of somebody standing in a bonfire. It's a place where it is a place of torment, and it is a place of wailing and gnashing of teeth, but it is a place where people choose to go and be alone. They choose to rebel against God, and God grants them their rebellion. He grants them a place apart from himself and says, this is where you will perpetually be alone, set apart to your rebellion. You rebelled against God, and your reward is to win. You get to win. And that but to win is something that, it sounds good, but it's actually a punishment.
That's one of the things that I love so much about the Christian God is one of the things that really, I don't know, hooked me, was having the ability to, I guess you could say, defeat him.
Mm.
You know, um, it's incredible.
God allows himself to be defeated, not because he's weaker, but because he desires willing servants.
Yeah.
So hell is the reward of those who wish to defeat God.
Mm.
It can be done. You can win. It's not much of a triumph, but you can win. The last paragraph of this chapter, Lewis says, "With this, our sketch of the grand miracle may end. Its credibility does not lie in obviousness. Pessimism, optimism, pantheism, materialism, all have this obvious attraction. Each is confirmed at the first glance by multitudes of facts. Later on, each meets insuperable obstacles. The doctrine of the Incarnation works into our minds quite differently. It digs beneath the surface, works through the rest of our knowledge by unexpected channels, harmonizes best with our deepest apprehensions and our second thoughts, and in union with these, undermines our superficial opinions. It has little to say to the man who is still certain that everything is going to the dogs, or that everything is getting better and better, or that everything is God, or that everything is electricity. Its hour comes when these wholesale creeds have begun to fail us. Whether the thing really happened is a historical question, the Incarnation he means, but when you turn to history, you will not demand for it that kind and degree of evidence which you would rightly demand for something intrinsically improbable. Only that kind and degree which you demand for something which, if accepted, illuminates and orders all other phenomena, explains both our laughter and our logic, our fear of the dead and our knowledge that it is somehow good to die, and which at one stroke covers what multitudes of separate theories will hardly cover for us if this is rejected." If you've enjoyed this talk, please like and subscribe and share with others. Thank you for listening to Just Conversations.